Hey guys, tonight we plunge, quite literally, nose first, into the less than fragrant reality of the medieval street. Imagine yourself there for a moment. You're navigating narrow cobbled lanes. If you're lucky, maybe packed dirt if you're not. The air is a symphony of competing aromas: wood smoke, baking bread, unwashed bodies, open sewers running down the middle of the street, and the faint, persistent tang of, well, let's just say livestock and poor sanitation. Sunlight, when it manages to penetrate the dense rooftops, illuminates thick clouds of dust motes dancing in the perpetual gloom. It's loud, it's crowded, and honestly, by modern standards, you probably wouldn't survive a week before succumbing to some delightful historical pathogen. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always wild to see where these stories reach. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through this scene, perhaps in a busy market square or near the docks of a bustling port city in, say, 14th century Europe. Everywhere you look, clothing tells a story. The cut of a tunic, the fabric of a cloak, the height of a hat, it all broadcasts status, wealth, and sometimes even profession. Society is obsessed with appearances, with ensuring everyone knows their place. And into this meticulously, if often messily ordered world, you encounter a curious sight. Amidst the browns, grays, and muted blues of common folk, perhaps a splash of vibrant red on a wealthy merchant, you notice women wearing veils or head coverings, which isn't unusual. Many respectable women cover their hair once married. But their veils, or perhaps a specific piece of their attire, are a striking, unmistakable yellow. Bright, perhaps even garish, standing out against the muted palette of the medieval urban landscape. Why yellow? What does that particular color signify in this world? And why would the authorities care so much about what these women wore? You see, navigating the medieval city wasn't just about dodging carts and trying not to step in something unpleasant. It was about reading visual cues. And for one of the oldest professions in the world, authorities across medieval Europe developed some particularly specific and often visually arresting methods of identification. Prostitution, though condemned by the church and subject to fluctuating levels of social stigma, was also an inescapable reality of urban life, where you had large numbers of transient men, merchants, sailors, soldiers, students. You had demand. And where you had demand, you had supply. Rather than eradicating it, which proved impossible, city councils and rulers often chose to regulate it. This regulation took many forms, confining it to specific districts, setting opening hours for brothels, imposing taxes, and, crucially, requiring prostitutes to identify themselves visually. Think about it from the perspective of the city officials, sitting in their council chambers, probably arguing over trade tariffs and where to put the new public latrine, another delightful medieval topic. They had a vested interest in public order, in controlling potential sources of unrest or disease, even if their understanding of disease was creative, shall we say. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from ancient Egypt? Medieval health theories could be just as wild. They also saw an opportunity for revenue. Prostitutes and brothel keepers could be taxed, but to tax them, you had to know who they were. To control them, you had to make them visible, distinct from the respectable women of the town. Enter the world of sumptuary laws. These weren't unique to prostitutes. Medieval authorities loved telling everyone what they could and couldn't wear based on their social class, profession, or religion. Peasants couldn't wear fine silks, only nobles could sport certain colors, and Jews were often compelled to wear distinctive badges or hats. These laws weren't just about economics, preventing commoners from dressing above their station, but also about maintaining a visible social hierarchy. Everyone needed to know their place and everyone else's place just by looking. So applying this logic to prostitution wasn't a huge leap. If cobblers had to wear specific shoes when working, and butchers had to wear aprons of a certain color, why shouldn't prostitutes have a mandatory uniform too? The idea was simple: make them instantly recognizable. This served multiple purposes from the authorities' viewpoint. It allowed officials to easily identify them for taxation or regulation enforcement. It allowed potential clients to find them. The authorities were often surprisingly pragmatic about this. And perhaps most importantly in their minds, it allowed respectable citizens, particularly women, to avoid them. The thinking was, if you could spot a prostitute from a distance, you wouldn't accidentally associate with her or mistake her for a good woman. It was about policing social boundaries, literally woven into the fabric of clothing. The specific requirements varied wildly from city to city, region to region, and century to century. Some places mandated a specific item of clothing, a cloak, a shirt, a hat. Others specified a particular fabric or cut. But one of the most persistent and widespread requirements, particularly from the later medieval period inwards in many parts of Europe, was the mandated color. And among the colors chosen, yellow cropped up with remarkable frequency. Now, why yellow? This is where it gets interesting. In the medieval world, colors were loaded with symbolism, and that symbolism wasn't always fixed. Yellow could mean gold, wealth, divine light. In religious art, halos were gold-hush yellow, but it also had a dark side. It was associated with deceit, treachery, and jealousy. Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus, was frequently depicted in yellow robes in medieval art. It was the color of bile, linked to illness and imbalance of the humors. And crucially, it was often the color used to mark out social outcasts or groups subject to prejudice. Jews, as mentioned, were frequently forced to wear yellow badges or hats in Christian Europe, a visually enforced segregation that foreshadowed much darker things to come. So when city councils decreed that prostitutes must wear yellow, they weren't picking the color out of a hat. They were deliberately choosing a color that already carried negative connotations of betrayal, marginalization, and otherness. It wasn't just identification. It was intended to be a mark of shame, a visible label of their profession and their perceived moral status. You weren't just wearing a yellow veil. You were wearing a symbol, a bright, conspicuous, hard-to-ignore symbol that screamed, "I am set apart." Imagine living under such a rule. You're trying to go about your business, perhaps trying to blend in when you're not actively working, maybe hoping to attend a market or visit a family member. But you can't. That yellow veil or sash or patch marks you out immediately. Everyone who sees you knows your profession. You become instantly identifiable, for better or worse, depending on who's looking. It's a constant physical reminder of your place in society, a label enforced by law. Historians still argue whether these laws were primarily about moral control, taxation, or simply imposing a visible social hierarchy. But whatever the primary motivation, the impact on the women forced to wear these markers must have been profound. It was a public declaration, a legally mandated advertisement, a scarlet letter in a different shade. And of all the colors they could have chosen, they chose one steeped in the symbolism of separation and suspicion, a symbol that screamed, "I am set apart." And that symbolism, that deliberate choice of yellow, wasn't random at all. To really understand why this color became such a widespread, mandated marker for prostitutes, you have to delve into the rather complex and often contradictory world of medieval color theory and symbolism. It wasn't like picking out a nice accent wall color at the paint store today. Colors in the Middle Ages were less about aesthetics and more about meaning. They were visual language, understood, or at least felt by most people, even the illiterate. Think back to that medieval street scene you were imagining. Everything communicates. The quality of the wool, the presence or absence of fur trim, the style of a shoe buckle. Color was perhaps the most potent communicator of all. Certain colors were incredibly expensive to produce. Rich reds from Kermes dye, deep blues from woad, or the even more costly indigo, vibrant purples reserved for royalty because the dye from murex snails was ludicrously rare and expensive. So wearing these colors immediately signaled immense wealth and high status. Wearing undyed wool or simple plant-based dyes meant you were likely a peasant. But color also carried layers of symbolic meaning, often drawn from religious texts, folklore, and pseudoscientific theories like humoral medicine. Red could mean passion, blood, martyrdom, or the wrath of God. Blue could represent heaven, purity for the Virgin Mary, or fidelity. Green was often linked to nature, growth, or sometimes unpredictability in fey creatures. And yellow? Yellow was a slippery one. On one hand, as we briefly touched on, yellow could be glorious. It was the color of gold, representing divine light, wealth, holiness. In religious art, you see saintly halos glowing gold yellow. The robes of Christ or important saints might be depicted in luminous yellow to suggest divinity or glory. It could represent harvest and fertility. So it wasn't inherently a bad color. Like a tricky relative, it had its good days. But then there was the other side of yellow, the side that medieval authorities seemed particularly keen to emphasize when it came to certain groups of people. This was the color of sulfur, associated with hell and the devil. It was the color of decay, of parchment yellowing with age, of leaves turning sickly before dying. It was the color linked to illness, specifically jaundice, the dreaded yellow sickness, which they understood through the lens of humoral theory. Remember the four humors? Blood, sanguine, red; phlegm, phlegmatic, white; black bile, melancholic black; and yellow bile, choleric yellow. An excess of yellow bile was thought to cause anger, irritability, and certain fevers or illnesses. So yellow was literally the color of a specific, unpleasant bodily imbalance. It carried the scent of sickness and the feverish, potentially violent temperament of the choleric person. But perhaps the most powerful negative association, especially in the context of marking out social pariahs, came from its link to betrayal and treachery within Christian iconography, Judas Iscariot, the disciple who sold out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. In countless medieval paintings, illuminated manuscripts, and passion plays, Judas was depicted wearing yellow robes. Sometimes it was a sickly, muddy yellow, sometimes a vibrant, almost aggressive one. Regardless of the shade, the message was clear. Yellow was the color of the betrayer. It was the color of deceit, of turning against loyalty and faith. This visual association was incredibly pervasive and deeply ingrained in the popular consciousness of the time. If you saw someone depicted in yellow, especially in a scene from the Gospels, you instantly knew who they were and what they represented. Applying this symbolism to a group like prostitutes was, from the authorities' perspective, chillingly logical. Prostitution was often framed not just as a sin, but as a form of moral treachery against societal norms, against the sanctity of marriage and family, even if the men seeking their services were often married themselves. Funny how the laws rarely targeted the clients with distinctive clothing, isn't it? Prostitutes were seen as seductresses, leading men astray, potentially spreading disease. Remember the bile connection? And operating outside the bounds of respectable society. They were, in a sense, perceived as betrayers of the social order, or at least dangerously apart from it. So marking them with the color of the ultimate biblical betrayer made a grim kind of sense within that worldview. But it wasn't just Judas. Yellow became a color associated with other groups considered outsiders or enemies of the dominant Christian society. Lepers, for instance, were sometimes required to wear yellow or particolored, two-tone clothing, or carry rattles or bells to warn others of their approach in their diseased state. Again, the association with illness, but also with forced segregation. Heretics, individuals who held beliefs contrary to the established church doctrine, were occasionally forced to wear yellow symbols like a yellow cross, particularly during the terrifying efficiency of the Spanish Inquisition, though this practice varied. It was a public branding, a permanent, or at least long-term, visual identifier of their perceived moral or spiritual corruption. And of course, there was the use of yellow to mark Jewish communities. This was perhaps the most widespread and enduring use of mandatory yellow identification, tragically preceding and echoing later horrific practices. Starting perhaps in the 13th century, in various parts of Europe, Jews were legally compelled to wear distinctive markers, badges, hats, like the pointed Judenhut, or patches, often in yellow. The reasons cited were varied: to prevent interfaith relationships, to make them easily identifiable for taxation, or simply as a mark of their different religious status in their history as the people who, from a Christian perspective, rejected Christ. This practice was not universal across medieval Europe, and its enforcement waxed and waned depending on the political climate and the whim of local rulers. But the use of yellow for this purpose was common enough that the color itself became synonymous with enforced segregation and prejudice against Jews in many areas. So, by the time medieval city councils started mandating yellow clothing for prostitutes, the color already had a well-established, multi-layered negative baggage. It was the color of sickness, betrayal, deceit, and enforced marginalization for various undesirable groups. It wasn't just a practical identifier, it was a symbolic burden. You weren't just wearing a color, you were wearing a message. A message that said, beware, I am outside the norm, possibly diseased, certainly morally suspect, and marked by the authorities as separate. Imagine the weight of that. Every time you stepped outside, that splash of yellow was like a target or a warning sign. It didn't just tell people what you did, it broadcast what society, or at least the people in power, thought of you. It stripped away any possibility of anonymity or blending in. It was a constant, visible judgment. Historians still debate the precise hierarchy of negative symbolism and how much weight each association, betrayal, illness, marginalization, carried in the minds of the lawmakers versus the general populace. But the overwhelming consensus is that yellow for this purpose was chosen for its negative connotations, not its positive ones. And this wasn't just a theoretical application of color symbolism. These were real laws with real consequences. If a prostitute was caught without her required yellow marker, she could face fines, imprisonment, public humiliation like being paraded through the streets, or even banishment from the city. The enforcement varied, of course, depending on the city and the time period. Some places might have been stricter than others. Sometimes the laws were more aspirational than rigorously enforced, like your city's bylaw about not leaving trash cans out too early that everyone ignores. But the fact that the law existed, that the threat of punishment was there, meant that wearing that yellow marker was not optional for these women. It was a condition of operating, or even just existing visibly, within the city limits. It's kind of darkly funny, isn't it? In a society obsessed with regulating everything from what fabric you could wear based on your income to how loud you could mourn at a funeral, they applied the same bureaucratic zeal to identifying sex workers. Right. Cobblestone repairs are buff-proof. The new market taxes agree. Oh, and don't forget to make sure those women are clearly labeled with the color of betrayal and jaundiced bile. Wouldn't want anyone getting confused. It sounds absurdly detailed, almost like a medieval HOA gone wild. But for the women affected, it was a daily reality of stigma and visibility, whether they wanted it or not. And the type of yellow sometimes mattered too. Was it a bright, sunny yellow like gold, or a dull, muddy, sulfurous yellow? The laws sometimes specified, or perhaps the available dyes dictated the exact shade. A brighter yellow might be more visible, while a muddier one leaned more into the sickness, decay symbolism. This level of detail in historical regulations can be hard to pin down because records might be vague, but it speaks to the careful, deliberate nature of these sumptuary laws. They weren't just saying wear something different. They were specifying a color loaded with particular, often damning meaning. It was literally painting a social boundary onto people. So you've got the heavy symbolic baggage attached to yellow, a color whispering tales of sickness, betrayal, and exclusion. How does a potent negative symbol like that transition from religious art and humoral theory into actual enforceable law? Well, welcome to the world of medieval sumptuary laws. If you thought modern building codes or dress codes for school were detailed, you haven't seen anything yet. Medieval authorities, particularly in burgeoning towns and cities, were obsessed with regulating appearances. They believed that what people wore reflected, and indeed influenced, their moral character and social standing. They wanted everyone's place in the rigid social hierarchy to be immediately obvious just by looking at them. It was like a walking, talking infographic of who was who, and crucially, who wasn't. These sumptuary laws, laws that dictated what people of different social classes could wear, were incredibly common across Europe from the 13th century onwards. They'd specify everything. Only nobles could wear ermine fur. Merchants could wear certain colors but not others. Peasants were restricted to drab fabrics and simple cuts. The stated goals were usually to prevent the lower classes from spending too much money, trying to imitate their betters, economic control, to maintain clear visual distinctions between social orders, social control, and sometimes vaguely for moral reasons, moral control, obviously. It was within this broader legal framework that the regulations targeting specific marginalized groups like prostitutes emerged. The laws requiring prostitutes to wear distinctive clothing, and often specifically yellow markers, weren't universal decrees handed down from an emperor covering all of Europe. Oh no, that would have been far too simple for the medieval world. Instead, these regulations cropped up piece by piece, town by town, principality by principality, almost like a patchwork quilt of local ordinances. You'd find them in city statutes, municipal codes, or decrees issued by town councils. A city in Italy might have one rule, a city in France another, in a German town something slightly different. It's like trying to navigate local parking rules in a foreign country today. Confusing, inconsistent, and potentially expensive if you mess up. The earliest examples historians have found of these types of laws, particularly mentioning yellow, seem to pop up around the late 13th and 14th centuries. This coincides neatly with the growth of urban centers and the increasing efforts by civic authorities to bring order, or at least their version of it, to the often chaotic urban landscape. As cities grew, so did the number of people living and working within them, including sex workers. Authorities weren't necessarily trying to abolish prostitution entirely. Indeed, in many cities, it was tolerated, segregated into specific districts. Red light districts aren't a modern invention. Shown, and sometimes even taxed, a clear indication of tacit acceptance, if not approval. But they absolutely wanted to control it, contain it, and most importantly, from their perspective, make it clearly visible to prevent respectable citizens, read married men and their wives, from being somehow contaminated or confused. So the laws weren't always about moral outrage alone. They were often about public order, social clarity, and even public health concerns. As we discussed with the yellow bile connection, they genuinely link certain colors to disease states, however incorrectly. The yellow marker was a public health warning of sorts, a social boundary marker, and a tool for enforcement all rolled into one potentially drab or bright piece of fabric. Now, was it always a yellow veil? Not exclusively, but it was a very common requirement, especially in areas where veils were standard headwear for married or respectable women. In many medieval societies, whether a woman wore a veil and the style of that veil communicated her marital status and social standing. Unmarried women might go bareheaded or wear simple ribbons or caps, while married women of status would cover their hair with elaborate veils, wimples, and other coverings. By forcing prostitutes to wear a yellow veil, the law created a direct visual contrast. It wasn't just about wearing yellow, it was about taking an item of clothing strongly associated with respectable womanhood and defacing it, symbolically and literally, with the color of infamy. Imagine if today they made people in certain professions wear a bright pink version of, say, a doctor's white coat. It takes a symbol of respectability and twists it into a mark of difference and implied disapproval. Other types of markers existed too. In some places, it might be a yellow scarf, a yellow sash, or even a specific yellow badge sewn onto the clothing. The requirement varied, but the color yellow remained a recurring theme. Think of it like the medieval version of a brightly colored uniform, except the uniform wasn't for a job you were proud of. It was a uniform designed to shame and segregate you. The stated goals of these laws, as found in surviving municipal records, were often quite blunt. They explicitly mentioned making it easy to distinguish prostitutes from honest women, a term that carried enormous weight. This wasn't just about preventing mix-ups at the local bakery. It was deeply tied to preventing what was perceived as illicit sexual activity, particularly between married men and prostitutes, and protecting the honor of virtuous women by ensuring they weren't mistaken for sex workers. It was also sometimes about identifying sex workers for the purpose of collecting taxes or fees, as we mentioned, which is a fascinating contradiction, simultaneously shaming and profiting from the same activity. The enforcement mechanism was typically left to city officials, constables, watchmen, or specially appointed inspectors. Imagine being a medieval city official whose job description includes, among other things like breaking up bar brawls and checking weights and measures at the market, ensuring that sex workers are wearing their legally mandated yellow accessories. It's not exactly glamorous work, is it? These officials would patrol public spaces, particularly areas known for prostitution or public thoroughfares, and check compliance. The penalties for not wearing the required yellow marker could be severe, designed to be both punitive and deterrent. Fines were common, and for women with limited means, this could be devastating. Imprisonment was another possibility, ranging from a few days to longer sentences, depending on the severity of the offense and the city's laws. Public humiliation was also a favored medieval punishment, often involving being paraded through the streets, sometimes in a cart, sometimes with signs detailing their offense, making them an object of scorn and ridicule for the townsfolk. In some cases, repeated offenses could even lead to banishment from the city entirely, stripping a woman of her livelihood, her social network, such as it was, and forcing her to seek refuge elsewhere, potentially in a less regulated, more dangerous environment. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it could ruin your life, such as it was in that difficult profession. Historians still argue whether these laws were primarily driven by genuine religious or moral zeal, a desire for social control and order, or simply pragmatic reasons like taxation and controlling the spread of venereal diseases, though their understanding of disease transmission was, shall we say, rudimentary. It was likely a complex mix of all these factors, with the emphasis shifting depending on the specific city, the time period, and the political and religious climate. For instance, cities with powerful merchant guilds might prioritize social order to facilitate trade, while those heavily influenced by local bishops might lean more into the moral aspects. There's no single, easy answer, which is why these historical details keep us history nerds up at night, tracing the threads through dusty old manuscripts. One quirky tidbit you sometimes find in the records is the level of detail some ordinances went into. Not just yellow veil, but sometimes specifying the material, or even the exact shade if possible, or requiring multiple items of yellow. It speaks to a real bureaucratic effort, a genuine attempt to make the marker unavoidable and unmistakable. It's almost comically specific, like arguing over the exact shade of caution tape. Is it safety yellow or amber yellow? Medieval city council meetings must have been thrilling. Item 7B, discussion on the appropriate luminosity standard for mandatory harlot head coverings. The efficacy of these laws is another point of debate. Did they really work? Did they successfully segregate society and prevent mixing? Or were they often ignored, circumvented, or inconsistently enforced? Probably a bit of all three, depending on the location and era. We have records of women being punished for not wearing the markers, which tells us the laws were enforced at least sometimes. But it's harder to gauge how many women simply didn't comply and never got caught, or how much daily life truly changed beyond the visible stigma. Did wearing the yellow veil make these women safer by clearly marking them? Or did it make them more vulnerable to harassment and violence? Again, historians debate this, and the answer is likely tragically complex. Think about the human element of this. Imagine being a young woman in, say, 14th century Paris. Life is already incredibly hard. You're likely poor, possibly an orphan or a runaway. You turn to prostitution as a means of survival because other options are non-existent or equally grim. And then the city council mandates that you wear a bright yellow piece of cloth every time you leave your lodging. It's not just an inconvenience. It's a constant, visible reminder of your marginal status. It tells everyone, from the pious merchant to the street urchin, that you are that kind of woman. It invites stares, whispers, potential harassment, and ensures you can never hope to blend in or escape your circumstances, even for a moment. It's a physical manifestation of social exclusion. It wasn't like you could just pop into the medieval equivalent of a department store and pick up a standard issue yellow veil. These items likely had to be made, perhaps from specific materials, and kept in good repair. Imagine the hassle, needing to find a source for yellow dye, which remember had all those complex symbolic associations, maybe even making dyers wary. Getting the fabric, sewing the item, and then making sure you had it on correctly every time you stepped out. It adds layers of logistical burden to an already difficult life. And woe betide you if it got lost, stolen, or damaged. Suddenly you're in violation of the law through no fault of your own. And of course, these laws highlight the inherent hypocrisy often present in medieval society and arguably many societies throughout history. The laws targeted the women providing the service, the visible practitioners of prostitution, while the male clients, including prominent citizens and even clergy, generally faced no such public shaming or mandatory identification. The burden of upholding respectable society's facade fell squarely on the shoulders of the most vulnerable. It's a pattern we've seen repeat throughout history, where the consequences of certain behaviors are disproportionately placed on those with the least power. So these yellow veils, scarves, or badges were far more than just pieces of cloth. They were legal instruments of control, steeped in negative symbolism, unevenly applied across a fragmented Europe, and carrying severe potential penalties for those who failed to comply. They are a stark reminder of how medieval authorities used clothing, color, and visibility as tools to manage, segregate, and stigmatize groups they deemed undesirable or outside the bounds of the proper social order. So you've journeyed through the murky waters of medieval yellow symbolism and navigated the dense thicket of sumptuary laws, understanding that authorities were keen on dressing up their social order in easily readable clothing. Now you're ready to pinpoint the moment and the places where these general principles solidified into the specific, legally binding requirement for prostitutes to wear yellow markers. It wasn't like a single grand decree echoed from a palace across Europe. This was far more granular, emerging city by city, almost like a social experiment tried out piecemeal in different urban laboratories. The earliest concrete evidence historians have unearthed for these specific yellow mandates points primarily to the burgeoning city-states of Italy during the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Think places like Venice, Padua, or Bologna. These weren't sleepy villages. They were dynamic, rapidly growing urban centers, hubs of trade, finance, and increasingly complex social interactions. As populations swelled with merchants, artisans, scholars, and laborers flooding in from the countryside, cities faced new challenges in maintaining order, public health as they understood it, and social hierarchy. Prostitution, which had often existed in a somewhat ambiguous legal space, sometimes tolerated, sometimes restricted, rarely ever completely eradicated, became a more visible and pressing concern for city councils. It's in the municipal statutes and decrees of these Italian cities that you start finding clauses specifically addressing the attire of sex workers. These weren't part of some overarching national law code because, well, nations as we understand them today weren't quite formed yet, and Italy was a collection of fiercely independent city-states and territories. No, this was local government, grappling with local issues and coming up with local solutions. Imagine the city council meetings, discussions about bridge repairs, market regulations, and then, tucked in there, debates about what certain women should be compelled to wear in public. It's a fascinating window into the priorities and anxieties of medieval urban life. Why these Italian cities first? Well, they were at the forefront of the commercial revolution, attracting diverse populations and experiencing the social friction that comes with rapid growth. They also had relatively strong traditions of communal self-governance, allowing them to enact detailed local legislation. And significantly, Italy was a place where cultural ideas, including those about symbolism and social status, circulated widely. The negative associations of yellow, already potent in Christian art and humoral theory, as we touched on, were certainly part of the cultural landscape here. It wasn't a huge leap, perhaps, to move from yellow represents illness, treachery, to people associated with perceived social moral ills should wear yellow. From these Italian roots, the practice seems to have spread outwards, albeit unevenly, along those same trade routes that connected Europe's cities. You start seeing similar regulations popping up in parts of France, particularly southern cities with strong links to Italy, and then later in German cities, and even sporadically elsewhere. It wasn't a uniform adoption, though. A city in Tuscany might mandate a yellow head covering, while a town in Provence required a yellow stripe on the sleeve, and a German city perhaps a specific yellow badge. This geographical variation is a mainstream historical fact. These laws were decentralized, reflecting local customs, power structures, and specific concerns. The laws themselves varied not just in the type of marker, but in the wording and specificity. Some laws might be quite vague, simply stating, "They shall wear a yellow sign." Others were remarkably detailed, specifying the size, shape, material, or even the required placement of the marker. One quirky or fringe tidbit you sometimes encounter in the surviving records is the attempt by lawmakers to define who exactly the law applied to, a task that proves surprisingly complex. Was it just women registered in a tolerance zone? Any woman receiving payment for sex? How could they prove it in public? These legal documents often reveal authorities grappling with the practicalities of enforcing a moralistic and segregating law in a busy, anonymous urban environment. They were trying to draw a bright yellow line around a profession that often operated in the shadows or blurred edges of society. Historians still argue whether the spread of these laws was primarily due to direct imitation, cities hearing about the practice elsewhere and copying it, or whether it was a case of multiple cities independently arriving at similar solutions to shared problems, drawing on the common cultural understanding of yellow's negative symbolism. The truth is probably a mix of both. There's evidence of municipal delegations visiting other cities to study their laws and governance, suggesting direct influence. But there's also the powerful pull of shared cultural meanings and the common challenges of urban administration in the period. It's hard to definitively say, yes, City B copied City A's Yellow Veil Law in 1347 because delegates so-and-so visited. The historical record is rarely that neat. The emergence of these laws also highlights a shift in how cities attempted to manage prostitution. Earlier approaches might have focused more on trying to ban it outright, often unsuccessfully, or tolerate it quietly. The move towards mandatory identification markers represents a step towards active, visible segregation and control. It wasn't just about regulating the act of prostitution, but about regulating the identity of the prostitute, making it impossible for her to blend in with the general population, particularly respectable women. This connects back to the anxieties about social order and preventing what authorities perceived as the pollution or blurring of social boundaries. Think about the bureaucratic effort involved. Someone had to draft these laws, debate them in council, get them approved, publish them, usually by reading them aloud in public places, and then, critically, enforce them. City officials needed to be instructed on what to look for and what to do if they found someone in violation. The very existence of these detailed regulations and records of punishments for not complying shows a deliberate and sustained effort by municipal governments to implement this policy of visible segregation. It wasn't just an idle threat. It was embedded in the legal code of the city. The timing is also important. The 14th century, when these laws became more prevalent, was a period of immense social upheaval, including famines, wars, and most famously, the Black Death. These crises often exacerbated existing social tensions and led authorities to seek tighter controls and scapegoats. While it's too simplistic to say the Black Death directly caused the Yellow Veil laws, the general atmosphere of anxiety, fear of disease, and a desire for order and clear social boundaries certainly provided fertile ground for such discriminatory regulations to take root and spread. The connection between yellow and disease, remember, was already there, making the color a logical choice in a world grappling with devastating epidemics. Moreover, the places where these laws emerged often had other regulations in place targeting marginalized groups, such as requirements for Jews to wear distinctive badges or hats. This suggests a broader governmental trend towards using mandatory clothing markers as a tool for social segregation and control, applying it to various groups deemed outside the mainstream for different reasons: religious, economic, or moral, in the case of prostitutes. It wasn't an isolated policy specific only to sex workers, but part of a wider pattern of using clothing to enforce social divisions. These early laws, however, were far from perfect from the perspective of the lawmakers. How did you ensure compliance? How did you prevent women from simply removing the marker when they were outside the most heavily policed areas? Did the laws apply inside private homes or taverns, or just on public streets? The surviving statutes sometimes include amendments or clarifications, suggesting authorities were continually adjusting the rules as they encountered loopholes or enforcement difficulties. It highlights the often messy reality of trying to legislate and control human behavior, particularly a profession that existed partly out of necessity and often operated on the fringes of legality anyway. So the story of the Yellow Veil Law isn't just about the color or the profession. It's deeply intertwined with the history of medieval urbanization, local governance, social control mechanisms, and the complex, often harsh, ways in which societies have historically attempted to define and segregate marginalized groups. It starts in the bustling, innovative, yet anxious cities of late medieval Italy, spreads unevenly across Europe, and becomes one distinctive, visible thread in the intricate tapestry of medieval urban regulations. So you've got the lay of the land, the laws originated, they spread unevenly, and the color yellow was firmly cemented as a symbol of shame and segregation. Now imagine yourself as one of the women living under these regulations. It wasn't just a line in a statute book somewhere in City Hall. This law crawled out of the parchment and attached itself directly to you, specifically to your head or sleeve, or wherever the local ordinance dictated. The requirement to wear that yellow marker wasn't some minor inconvenience, like forgetting your reusable grocery bag. It was a fundamental alteration of your daily reality, a constant, visible signifier broadcast to everyone you encountered. Stepping out your door, you're instantly identifiable. The moment you're in public view, your status is announced. You're no longer just a woman walking down the street. You are the woman wearing the yellow marker. This means you can't melt into the crowd. You can't simply go about your business unnoticed, and you certainly can't pretend to be someone you're not, at least not easily. It's like wearing a neon sign that says, "Look at me, I am that sort of person." In an age where fitting in, even just visually, was crucial for safety and respectability. Every eye, every glance, potentially holds judgment, suspicion, or worse. This hypervisibility profoundly impacted your movement through the city. Certain areas might become no-go zones, not because the law explicitly forbade you from being there, though some laws did have geographical restrictions, but because the risk of harassment or confrontation was too high. Passing through a market square during peak hours? Be prepared for jeers, insults, or people physically recouping away from you. Trying to attend a public festival or religious procession? You'd likely be met with hostility or outright exclusion. Even walking down a residential street could invite unwelcome attention from neighbors or local busybodies. Your world shrinks, confined to less reputable districts or specific licensed areas, if they existed. It's the medieval equivalent of being instantly de-verified on social media, but with actual physical consequences. The yellow marker also made you an easy target for crime. Muggers or thieves knew that someone visibly marked might be less likely to report an attack to the authorities, or that their testimony might be dismissed if they did. Corrupt officials or watchmen could single you out for bribes or fines, using the simple fact of your status as leverage, whether or not you had actually broken any other laws. You were, in essence, stripped of a layer of anonymity and perceived respectability that offered some degree of protection to others. This increased vulnerability is a mainstream historical fact supported by numerous accounts and legal records detailing the precarious position of marginalized groups. Social interactions became fraught with difficulty. How do you make friends when your identity is constantly on display, an identity that many in society are taught to shun? How do you purchase goods from a vendor who might eye you with suspicion or refuse you service? Even casual conversation becomes potentially risky. If someone is seen speaking amicably with you, they might risk staining their own reputation. It creates a profound sense of isolation, a constant awareness that you are perceived as other, set apart and beneath the rest of society. It's like being perpetually picked last for dodgeball, but the stakes are your livelihood and personal safety. Historians still argue whether the primary intent of these laws was purely punitive and segregating, or whether there was a genuine, if misguided, belief that visible identification could help authorities manage public health or prevent the spread of venereal disease, though the understanding of disease transmission was rudimentary. While the stated goal might have sometimes included preventing disorder or scandal, the practical effect was undeniable: intensified stigma and marginalization, making life significantly harder and more dangerous for the women targeted. Think about the simple things: going to the baker, fetching water from the communal well, attending church services, if you dared or were allowed. Each task that required you to enter public space became an ordeal, a performance under critical gaze. You couldn't blend in with the other women carrying baskets or children. Your yellow marker announced your profession and, in the eyes of many, your moral failing. This constant exposure to public disapproval and potential harassment took a significant toll, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically. It was a form of public shaming enforced by law, designed to make the targeted individuals feel the weight of societal condemnation with every step they took outside their private space. One quirky or fringe tidbit that sometimes surfaces in the records is the ingenuity women might employ to circumvent these laws, or the specific ways they were caught. For example, some might try to wear the required yellow marker, but make it as small and inconspicuous as possible. Perhaps a tiny knot of yellow thread or a narrow band hidden mostly by hair. Others might attempt to pull shawls or hoods further forward to obscure the mark. The fact that laws sometimes had to be amended to specify minimum sizes or locations for the markers suggests that this kind of passive resistance and strategic evasion was occurring. Authorities were constantly playing a game of sartorial cat and mouse. The economic implications were also severe. Being easily identifiable might make it harder to find clients who weren't seeking out commercial sex, limiting your potential income sources if you had other skills. More importantly, it could make it incredibly difficult to transition out of the profession. If you wanted to stop and pursue another trade or marry, your reputation was irrevocably stained, literally marked on your clothing for everyone to see. The yellow marker wasn't just a badge for your working hours, it was a permanent brand in the public sphere, limiting future opportunities and potentially trapping women in a life they might have wished to leave. It's like having a permanent former life choices on display sticker on your forehead, making it tricky to get a job interview as, say, a nun. The enforcement of these laws added another layer of difficulty. Were you wearing the marker correctly? Was it visible enough? Officials, townspeople, or even self-appointed moral guardians could challenge you, leading to fines, public reprimands, or even harsher punishments if you were deemed defiant or caught without the marker. The constant threat of legal or social sanction loomed over your head, adding stress and danger to an already precarious existence. It turned simple daily tasks into potential legal minefields. So the next time you feel slightly awkward because you are wearing a slightly questionable outfit to the grocery store, spare a thought for the medieval women for whom a legally mandated piece of clothing made every public outing a gauntlet of judgment, danger, and profound social isolation. This little yellow marker wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was a heavy burden, shaping their movements, interactions, and sense of self within the rigid and often unforgiving structure of medieval society. It was a physical manifestation of their marginalization, a constant reminder that they were seen as different, undesirable, and worthy of being conspicuously segregated from the rest of the community. The simple act of dressing in the morning became a compliance ritual, a preparation for facing a world that had decided you didn't fully belong. So you've seen how that little patch of yellow fabric fundamentally reshaped the daily existence of the women legally mandated to wear it, turning every public street into a potential ordeal. But these laws didn't operate in a vacuum, affecting only the specific individuals they targeted. Their tendrils reached further, subtly and sometimes not so subtly, impacting all women in medieval society, particularly those deemed respectable. Imagine yourself now as a woman without the yellow marker, a wife, a widow, a daughter from a good family. The very existence of the marked women, constantly visible, served as a stark, walking, talking warning. They were the cautionary tale, the public example of what happened if you deviated from the expected path of virtue and domesticity. Their yellow veil or patch wasn't just a label for them, it was a visual reinforcement of the boundaries for you. Every time you saw a woman in yellow, it underscored the importance of maintaining your own spotless reputation, of dressing modestly, of behaving according to strict social codes. It was a constant, passive form of social control, reminding you that deviation had highly visible, deeply stigmatizing consequences. It's like the medieval equivalent of a public service announcement warning you to stay in your lane, except the warning is a person walking down the street. This created a subtle pressure on respectable women to actively distinguish themselves. How did you ensure you wouldn't be mistaken, even for a moment, for one of them? You adhered even more rigidly to fashion norms. You were meticulous about your public demeanor. You might even go out of your way to avoid certain areas or routes where marked women were known to frequent. Your own clothing, your accessories, your very comportment became tools to signal your virtue and distance yourself from the visible other. This reinforced the existing social hierarchy and deepened the divide between different groups of women, sometimes fostering suspicion and judgment even amongst yourselves. Here lies a particularly juicy layer of societal hypocrisy, a mainstream historical fact that historians have dissected extensively. While the laws focused relentlessly on shaming and segregating the women providing sexual services, they were conspicuously silent, or at least much less harsh, when it came to the men who were their clients. The men who sought out and paid for these services, often from respectable walks of life, merchants, artisans, even sometimes clergy or nobility, faced no public shaming, no mandated identifying clothing, no legal requirement to advertise their activities. They could move freely through society, their reputations largely untarnished by interactions that led to profound public degradation for the women involved. This glaring double standard highlights how these laws were less about stamping out the sex trade itself, which authorities often tacitly allowed or even licensed and taxed, and more about controlling and punishing women who operated outside the sanctioned patriarchal structures. The sex trade existed because there was demand, largely from men. Yet, the burden of shame and legal enforcement fell almost exclusively on the supply side, on the women. It's like outlawing only the sale of ice cream cones, but letting everyone who buys one stroll around scot-free. It just doesn't quite add up if your stated goal is just order. Historians still argue whether this gendered asymmetry in punishment was purely a reflection of pervasive misogyny, an economic strategy to manage a necessary evil, or a complex mix of both. Was it simply easier and more politically palatable to target a marginalized group of women than to regulate the behavior of male citizens, some of whom held positions of power? Very likely. The hypocrisy is hard to miss. The very authorities enacting laws to shame these women were often the same ones collecting taxes from the brothels or looking the other way for a fee. One quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some places, the laws requiring yellow markers for prostitutes were introduced at the same time as laws attempting to regulate the attire of respectable women, dictating hemlines, fabrics, or head coverings. It was part of a broader medieval obsession with using clothing to enforce social order and identify people's status, occupation, and even perceived morality. So while one group was forced to wear a marker of shame, the other was simultaneously being micromanaged in their attempts to signify their respectability through sartorial conformity. Everyone's wardrobe was under scrutiny, just for different reasons. The existence of these visible markers also normalized the idea of publicly identifying and shaming certain groups based on their lifestyle or perceived deviance. While the yellow marker specifically targeted prostitutes, the concept of legally mandated identifying clothing or symbols was also applied to other marginalized groups, like Jews, the infamous yellow badge being a later but related example, or sometimes even lepers. This created a societal precedent for using clothing as a tool of segregation and control, making it easier to implement such measures against other groups in the future. It's like a warm-up exercise in using fashion for social engineering. So while the yellow veil or patch was a heavy burden for the woman wearing it, its presence cast a long shadow over medieval society as a whole. It reinforced gender roles, tightened the leash on respectable women's behavior, showcased a deeply embedded societal hypocrisy regarding male and female sexual conduct, and normalized the use of visible markers for segregation and control. It wasn't just a garment, it was a social statement, a legal instrument, and a daily reminder of the complex, often unfair, web of expectations and restrictions placed upon women in the Middle Ages. It made you think twice about your hat choices, even if it wasn't yellow. The laws, ostensibly aimed at controlling disorder, kibar, effectively created a permanent underclass, visibly labeled and easily targeted, while leaving the demand side of the equation largely unregulated and unpunished. This disparity wasn't lost on everyone at the time, though challenging such ingrained social norms and legal structures was incredibly difficult. The yellow marker therefore serves as a potent symbol not just of the struggles of medieval prostitutes, but also of the broader gender dynamics, societal control mechanisms, and pervasive hypocrisy that characterize the era. It's a lot of historical baggage for one small piece of fabric. So you've felt the weight of that yellow marker, experienced the constant scrutiny, and seen how its mere existence cast a shadow not just on the women forced to wear it, but on medieval society's female population as a whole. It was a heavy burden, a public declaration designed to strip away anonymity and enforce shame. But here's the thing about human history, about people really. Even under the most oppressive rules, even when society tries to brand you, people are remarkably inventive when it comes to finding ways around things. You might be required to wear a yellow veil, but the law rarely dictated exactly how big it had to be, or precisely how prominently displayed. There's always a loophole, or at least a fraying edge on the rule book if you look hard enough. Imagine yourself wearing that veil. The law says yellow, okay? But does it say bright yellow? Does it specify the exact shade of ochre, saffron, or maybe something closer to a muddy mustard? Probably not with medieval legislative precision, which was often more concerned with the spirit of the law, public identification, than pixel-perfect hex codes. So perhaps you'd try to find fabric that was yellow, yes, but perhaps a duller, less vibrant shade. Maybe something that had been washed a few too many times, or dyed with less expensive, less light-fast pigments that would quickly fade in the sun. It's a small act of defiance, barely noticeable to a casual glance, but it's something. You're complying, technically, but you're also subtly blurring the lines. It's like being told you have to wear a name tag, but you write your name in tiny font on a clear sticker. Then there's the placement. The law might say on the head or on the clothing. Okay, does it say it has to be front and center, like a flashing neon sign? Probably not. So you might position it further back on your head, partially obscured by another non-yellow scarf or coif that is allowed. If it's a patch on clothing, perhaps you sew it onto the inside of your cloak, near the opening, where it's visible when you walk but mostly hidden when you stand still or sit. Or maybe you place it low down on your hem, near your ankle, where mud and street debris are likely to obscure it anyway. These weren't grand gestures of rebellion, they were quiet, everyday maneuvers, born out of necessity and a deep human desire for a sliver of dignity and anonymity. It's the medieval equivalent of strategically parking your car in a way that the parking meter attendant might miss your expired ticket. Small risks, potentially big relief. Another common strategy, which is a mainstream historical fact, was simply operating where enforcement was less strict or non-existent. Laws were strongest and most consistently applied in major urban centers, the bustling towns and cities where authorities had the infrastructure to monitor citizens. Out in the countryside, in smaller villages, or along remote travel routes between settlements, the watchful eyes of city officials simply weren't present. You might find that women moved between town and country, spending time in the city when absolutely necessary, perhaps following seasonal trade or fairs, but retreating to less regulated areas where they could operate with less scrutiny and without the constant pressure of the yellow marker. It wasn't just about avoiding the veil, it was about avoiding the finimas, the harassment, and the constant grinding judgment. This movement wasn't always easy or safe, mind you, as medieval roads had their own set of delightful perils. From bandits to literally just falling into a giant pothole the size of a donkey. Beyond passive circumvention, there were also more active forms of negotiation and leveraging. These women weren't powerless objects. They lived in a society where relationships and connections mattered. They had clients, some of whom might be men of means or influence. While these men were largely immune from the shaming laws themselves, a hypocrisy we definitely touched on last section, their reputation could still be indirectly affected if their associates were seen being publicly harassed or arrested. In some cases, a wealthy client might offer a degree of informal protection, paying a small bribe to a watchman to look the other way, or using their social standing to smooth over a minor infraction if a woman they patronized got into trouble. It wasn't a bulletproof shield, but it could offer occasional respite. Think of it like this. You have a regular customer who happens to be the baker's son. He doesn't want any fuss that might get back to his dad. So maybe he slips you an extra loaf of bread and tells you where the town guard isn't patrolling tonight. It's not a formal agreement, not a contract, but it's leveraging the social web. These informal protections highlight how personal relationships could sometimes cut across formal legal structures in the complex tapestry of medieval life. Historians still argue whether these client-provider relationships offered significant long-term benefits or merely occasional unreliable protection against the systemic pressures these women faced. It's easy to romanticize underground networks, but the reality was likely far more precarious and dependent on the whims of individuals. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. In some rare documented instances, women legally designated as prostitutes managed to accumulate enough wealth from their work to purchase property, often small houses or rooms, sometimes even within the red light districts themselves. Owning property, even a small piece of it, granted a certain level of status and legal standing in medieval towns that was otherwise difficult for single women, let alone those in stigmatized professions, to attain. This property ownership could sometimes provide a small measure of protection. If the authorities wanted to fine you or expel you, they might face slightly more bureaucratic hurdles if you were a property owner with a stake in the community, albeit a marginal one, than if you were a transient individual. It's a strange paradox. A profession that legally marked you for shame could, in rare cases, be the very means to acquire a tangible asset that granted a tiny fragment of legal respectability and rootedness. It's like getting a parking ticket, but using the fine money to buy a small piece of the parking lot. Furthermore, the medieval legal landscape was a patchwork quilt of varying local customs, charters, and municipal ordinances. What was strictly enforced in one town might be completely ignored, or even prohibited, in another just a day's journey away. This variation provided opportunities. If the rules on yellow veils were particularly harsh in, say, Florence, maybe you knew that across the regional border in Siena, the authorities were more interested in taxing bathhouses than policing specific clothing. This constant flux in regional difference, a mainstream historical fact, meant that staying informed about local regulations, or the lack thereof, was crucial for survival and could allow women to strategically relocate to areas with more favorable conditions or less zealous enforcement. It was like needing to know which states have speed cameras and which don't before planning a road trip, but the stakes were significantly higher than a speeding ticket. There was also the inherent ambiguity in medieval society regarding certain professions and the blurred lines between them. As we touched upon, bathhouse attendants, laundresses who cleaned clothes, including linens from less than reputable establishments, tavern keepers, and even some forms of domestic service could overlap with or provide cover for sex work. If you were challenged by an official, you might claim you were simply a laundress delivering clean clothes or a serving girl on an errand. The success of this strategy depended heavily on your ability to appear convincing, the disposition of the official questioning you, and whether you had any actual dirty laundry, metaphorical or literal, on hand to back up your story. This ambiguity offered a legal gray area, a place to hide in plain sight that was not available to women whose profession was their sole form of income and public identity. And let's not forget the power of community. These women didn't exist in isolation. They formed networks, lived together in certain districts, and shared information. They knew which watchmen could be bribed with a few coins or a drink, which streets were dangerous after dark, and which officials were particularly zealous in their enforcement of the Yellow Veil laws. They could warn each other, pool resources in times of trouble, like paying a fine or supporting someone who was ill, and provide mutual aid. While society might ostracize them, they often built their own internal support systems, a testament to resilience and solidarity in the face of adversity. It's the medieval version of a group chat warning you where the speed traps are. These strategies, the subtle defiance in wearing the marker, the strategic relocation, the leveraging of relationships, the acquisition of property, the exploitation of legal ambiguities, and the power of community, weren't perfect solutions. They didn't erase the stigma or the hardship. The yellow veil remained a potent symbol of marginalization and vulnerability. But they demonstrate that even under rigid social and legal constraints, medieval women found ways to navigate, resist, and carve out spaces for themselves, asserting agency in environments designed to deny it. They weren't just passive recipients of harsh laws. They were active players, however constrained, in the ongoing negotiation of social boundaries and personal survival. It reminds you that history isn't just about the rules that were made, but about all the ingenious ways people figured out how to bend, break, or simply step around them. Sometimes the biggest stories are in the tiny details, the faded fabric, the hidden patch, the whispered warning. So you've tried the subtle fade, maybe worn the marker low, or stuck to the edges of town where the guards were more interested in chasing stray pigs than policing hemlines. You've explored the tiny cracks in the system, found the frayed edges of the rules, and perhaps even leveraged a friendly baker's son to get a heads up on patrols. These small acts of agency, these navigations around the edges of the law, were vital for survival. But the yellow veil, or whatever form the public marker took, wasn't just a legal requirement. It was a social one, a signpost stuck onto you that broadcast a message to everyone you encountered. And that message, loud and clear, was one of separation, judgment, and exclusion. Imagine walking through the marketplace on a busy morning. The air hums with noise. The bleating of sheep, the haggling of merchants, the calls of street vendors selling pies and ale. People jostle past, sacks of grain bump your shoulder. A child laughs somewhere nearby. It should feel like just another slice of medieval life, anonymous in the crowd. But you're not anonymous. The moment someone catches sight of that splash of yellow, whether it's a veil, a cap, an armband, or a patch on your cloak, depending on the local decree, the atmosphere shifts. You feel the eyes. Oh, you feel them. They linger for a fraction too long, dart away quickly when you meet them, or worse, stare openly with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. It's a constant performance of being othered. Every single public interaction becomes a potential source of microaggression, a reminder of your legally mandated status. Buying bread might involve a slightly steeper price or a colder transaction. Trying to join a conversation among neighbors on a stoop results in awkward silences or polite but firm excuses to leave. Even seeking comfort in a church could be fraught. While technically God's house was open to all, the judgmental stares and whispers from the respectable members of the congregation could feel like their own, very effective form of excommunication. It's like having a really embarrassing social media post follow you into every single real-life interaction. Except, instead of being online, it's literally attached to your head, impossible to scroll past. This perpetual marking and scrutiny had a profound effect on personal relationships, which is a major social impact beyond the law itself. For women already engaged in sex work, the legal requirement to wear a marker often codified and intensified existing social stigma. It made it incredibly difficult to maintain ties with family members who wished to distance themselves from the shame the profession brought upon the family name. Parents might disown daughters, siblings might refuse contact, and children might be taken away or raised in secret to avoid the taint of their mother's profession. It's not hard to imagine the heartbreak of being barred from family gatherings or having to see loved ones only in secret, fearing discovery and the resulting social fallout. Furthermore, the marker made forming new, conventional relationships almost impossible. Marriage, for instance, was largely out of the question with a respectability marker like the yellow veil. What family would accept such a bride for their son? What dowry could compensate for such public shame? The yellow marker wasn't just a scarlet letter. It was like wearing a sign that said, socially ineligible, in flashing lights. This forced isolation reinforced reliance on the community of other women in similar circumstances and the often transactional relationships with clients. It created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Society branded these women as outcasts, and the branding itself pushed them further into the margins, making it harder to escape the very status the marker was meant to highlight and shame. Public perception solidified around the visual cue. The yellow veil became shorthand not just for a woman who engaged in sex work, but for a range of negative stereotypes: immoral, unclean, dangerous, a threat to the social order and the sanctity of marriage. This pervasive negative perception had a chilling effect on all women in society, not just those legally required to wear the marker. If a woman dressed too colorfully, or walked alone in the street at certain hours, or spoke too freely, she might be subject to suspicion, harassment, or even false accusation of being one of those women. The very existence of the marker and the class of women it identified created a heightened sense of anxiety around female behavior and public presence, forcing respectable women to conform to stricter norms of dress and conduct to avoid any potential association. It's the historical equivalent of certain clothing items being labeled inappropriate and anyone wearing them being judged, but with way harsher consequences than just a dress code violation. The legal requirement for a distinguishing marker also contributed to the physical segregation of these women, which is a mainstream historical fact. While not always legally mandated in the same way the clothing was, many towns and cities saw the de facto or de jure development of specific districts or streets where women engaged in sex work were expected, or even required, to live and work. These were the infamous red light districts of the medieval period, often located near the edges of town, by city gates or close to docks or busy markets where travelers and merchants congregated. The yellow marker helped direct people, both clients and authorities, to these areas and visually identified the women operating within them. Living and working in these segregated districts had complex social implications. On one hand, it concentrated the stigma and surveillance, making it difficult to escape the watchful eyes of authorities and neighbors alike. The negative perception associated with the yellow veil was amplified within these areas. However, and this is where historians still argue whether these districts offered any benefit or were purely tools of control, these districts also provided a degree of community and mutual support among the women. Within their own neighborhoods, they could potentially find solidarity, shared information about navigating laws and clients, and perhaps a space where the constant external judgment was momentarily lessened among themselves. It's debated whether this was a genuine, if precarious, form of community forged in shared adversity, or simply another layer of confinement imposed by a society that wanted to neatly package and contain everything it deemed undesirable. Consider a quirky or fringe tidbit. In some specific German towns, there were instances where the officials responsible for overseeing these districts, often called Frauenvogt, literally women's advocate, or bailiff, were sometimes drawn from the ranks of former prostitutes or women closely associated with the trade. While their primary role was enforcement and tax collection, their background might have given them a unique, albeit potentially complicated, understanding of the lives of the women they supervised. This is a rare and debated point, as their position of power still stemmed from the patriarchal legal system, but it hints at the possibility of complex relationships and potentially, in very specific circumstances, a slightly less brutal enforcement than might be expected from an outsider. It's like the manager of a truly terrible call center having previously been a customer. Maybe they get it, maybe they're just better at being terrible. The internal impact of the yellow marker and the associated social shaming cannot be overlooked either. Constantly being identified and judged by a visible symbol must have taken a significant psychological toll. The internalization of societal shame, the erosion of self-worth under constant scrutiny, the difficulty in maintaining a sense of dignity when your profession was publicly denounced and marked for all to see, these are the hidden costs of such laws. While medieval sources rarely give us direct, personal accounts of the emotional lives of these women, the sheer weight of the social pressures they faced suggests a reality filled with hardship, resilience, and a constant negotiation with a world that wanted to reduce them to a single, visible label. Think about the feeling of constantly having to explain yourself, or worse, knowing that no explanation is needed because the explanation is literally pinned to you. You're not just you're you, the one with the yellow. Every conversation, every transaction, every glance passes through that filter. It warps interactions, colors perceptions, and reduces your identity to a single legally defined role. It's medieval public relations gone spectacularly wrong, designed not to build a brand, but to tear one down, your very self. The strategies of circumvention we discussed in Section 7 were born precisely out of this intense social pressure. They weren't just about evading fines or arrest, they were about attempting to reclaim a tiny bit of anonymity, to blur the lines, to find moments where you weren't just the woman in the yellow veil, but perhaps just another face in the crowd, or a neighbor sharing a quiet moment, or simply yourself. The social impact of the marker was so pervasive, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, that finding ways to mitigate its effect became a constant, exhausting necessity. So, while the law mandated the physical marker, its true power lay in its ability to weaponize social judgment and exclusion. It transformed a piece of fabric into a powerful tool of control, isolating women, reinforcing negative stereotypes, impacting families, and shaping public space. It's a stark reminder that laws don't just exist on paper. They live and breathe and often suffocate in the way people interact, judge, and perceive one another in the messy, complicated reality of everyday life. The yellow veil was more than cloth. It was a social barrier made visible. So you've felt the weight of that yellow, haven't you? Experienced how a simple splash of color could reshape your every interaction, turning anonymity into scrutiny. It felt absolute, like a universal truth etched into the stone of every medieval street. But here's the thing about medieval laws, and really about history in general. They weren't a neat, uniform package delivered by some central legislative headquarters. There was no single European parliament churning out identical decrees on visible markers for sex workers. Instead, these rules, like so much else in the Middle Ages, were incredibly local, varying wildly from one city-state to the next, even from one decade to the next within the same town, depending on who was in charge and what they had for breakfast that day. The idea of a public marker was common, yes, but the specifics? Oh, they were a patchwork quilt of regional quirks and municipal decrees. It wasn't always a yellow veil. In some places, it might have been a yellow cap, perhaps required to sit jauntily on your head or pulled low over your hair. Elsewhere, it could be a specific color worn on your cloak or gown, maybe red or even striped patterns that were otherwise forbidden to certain groups. The placement varied too. An armband, a patch sewn conspicuously onto the shoulder or chest, a specific type of footwear, or even a particular style of belt. Imagine arriving in a new town, already navigating the precarious life you led, and having to figure out the local dress code for outcasts. Was it yellow? Was it red? Was it two green stripes and then a purple hat? It was like trying to pack for a European backpacking trip in the 14th century. Better bring a suitcase full of potentially required shame attire options. Venice, that jewel of the Adriatic built on canals and commerce, is famously associated with the Yellow Veil. The Venetian Republic was a major trading power, attracting people from all corners of the known world, including a significant population of traveling merchants, sailors, and yes, women engaged in sex work. The authorities there were keen on maintaining order and, perhaps more pragmatically, regulating and taxing the profession. The yellow veil became their chosen identifier. But even in Venice, the specific shade, style, or exact material might evolve over time. One decree might specify a bright, sulfur yellow veil made of silk, while a later one might accept a mustard yellow wool or linen. It wasn't just yellow veil, it was yellow veil, specifically this kind, according to the law passed last Tuesday. It's enough to make you miss the simplicity of just not being required to wear a specific hat that screams your profession. Other Italian cities had their own takes. Florence, Genoa, Bologna. They might mandate yellow or perhaps red or striped garments. German towns like Nuremberg or Augsburg might opt for different symbols or colors altogether. Perhaps a specific type of badge or a different color combination deemed undesirable for respectable citizens. French towns had their own ordinances, often tied to royal or seigneurial authority rather than just municipal councils. This geographical variation is a mainstream historical fact. The regulations were reflections of local culture, economic priorities, and the specific anxieties of the ruling elite in that particular place and time. Some places were primarily concerned with public morality, others with disease control, though less understood in a modern sense, and many, perhaps most, with the ever-present goal of taxation and control. These specific regulations targeting women in sex work weren't isolated oddities. They were part of a much larger legal framework that defined and controlled what people wore based on their social standing, profession, and religion. Sumptuary laws. Sumptuary laws, the original medieval fashion police. These laws were incredibly common throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, dictating everything from the types of fabrics you could wear, no silk for peasants, thank you very much, to the colors, only nobles could wear purple, a notoriously expensive dye, to the amount of ornamentation you were allowed on your clothes. Fur was a big one. Certain types of fur were reserved exclusively for the highest ranks of nobility. Buttons, embroidery, the length of your shoelace tips, seriously, look up poulains and the laws about them. It was all potentially regulated. The purpose of sumptuary laws was multifaceted, but primarily aimed at maintaining a visible social hierarchy. In a society where inherited status was paramount, clothing was a key indicator of who was who. If a wealthy merchant's wife could afford to dress like a duchess, it blurred the lines and potentially undermined the traditional order. Sumptuary laws were designed to prevent this status anxiety among the elite and keep everyone in their sartorial place. They also sometimes had economic goals, like promoting local textile production or limiting expenditure on expensive foreign luxuries. And of course, they had a moral dimension, aimed at curbing perceived extravagance and luxury, which the church often railed against. It was basically the government telling you, your clothes are too loud, dial it down, and also you're not rich enough for that. Placing the mandatory marker for women in sex work within the context of these broader sumptuary laws makes perfect sense. It wasn't just about singling them out for shame or identification. It was also about clearly defining their social status through their clothing, just like a peasant's rough wool tunic or a nobleman's velvet doublet did for others. Their marker wasn't about displaying high status, obviously, but about displaying a specific, legally defined, and socially marginalized status. It was sumptuary law inverted, not about forbidding certain finery, but about requiring a badge of perceived dishonor. This connection is a mainstream historical fact. These rules were often listed within or alongside other municipal sumptuary regulations. The motivations for this specific category of sumptuary law, the markers for sex workers, are debated. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation was moral control and public order, aimed at making it easy to identify and thus shame and isolate these women. Economic focused on making them easily identifiable for taxation or regulation by city officials, or simply pragmatic, a way to distinguish them from other women to protect the virtue of respectable women and prevent confusion or unwanted social mixing. It was likely a blend of these, with the emphasis shifting depending on the specific city, the era, and the particular official pushing the decree. Was it genuinely about curbing perceived sin, or just about having a tidy ledger of taxable individuals? Probably a bit of both, wrapped up in a convenient package of moral righteousness. Consider a quirky or fringe tidbit related to the enforcement of these laws. In some places, officials known as cloth inspectors or similar titles were tasked with enforcing all sumptuary laws, including the one about the markers. These weren't just general constables. They were specifically looking at what people were wearing. Imagine their job, wandering the streets, peering at hems, checking sleeves, and yes, specifically looking for that splash of forbidden color or required marker. There are records in some towns mentioning fines being levied not just on the woman wearing the wrong thing, but sometimes also on the tailor who made the garment without the required marker, or the person who rented lodgings to a woman without confirming she was properly marked. It turned enforcing clothing regulations into a multi-person effort, like a medieval neighborhood watch focused entirely on fashion violations. Oi, is that silk lining? Let me see your papers. Navigating this landscape of varying rules must have been exhausting. If you traveled from Venice to Florence, you'd need to know that the rule might be slightly different. Maybe in Venice it was a veil worn outside the brothel district, but in Florence it was a patch you had to wear everywhere? And what if you moved to a small town that had no specific rule for sex workers? Would you try to blend in, hoping no one asked questions? Or would the established tradition of other towns create an expectation, making you feel exposed without a marker? This lack of uniformity, while a headache for those trying to live under these laws, highlights their local origins and the fact that medieval life, while rigid in many ways, also contained pockets of variation and exceptions. It wasn't one big gray blob of identical oppression. It was more like a mosaic, with different patterns of control and stigma in each tile. The connection between the specific markers for prostitutes and the broader sumptuary laws is crucial for understanding the mindset of the time. It shows that the authorities viewed this profession not just as a moral issue, but also as a matter of social order and classification, something that needed to be clearly visible and regulated through the same mechanisms used to control the display of wealth or status. It reinforced the idea that these women occupied a distinct, legally defined, and publicly identifiable place outside the norms of respectable society, right there alongside rules about not wearing pointed shoes that were too long if you weren't a knight. It's almost comically bureaucratic in its attempt to categorize and control everything through clothing. So while the yellow veil is a common shorthand, remember that it represents a diverse set of local ordinances across different regions and centuries. It could be yellow or red or striped. It could be a veil, a cap, a patch, or a belt. But whatever the specific form, it served the same fundamental purpose: to use clothing as a tool of social engineering, to mark out a group, and to ensure that their perceived status was visible for all to see, just as firmly as a knight's spurs or a merchant's cap marked theirs. It was sumptuary law applied to the lowest rung of the social ladder, a way to use the very fabric you wore to stitch you into a specific, marginalized position within the community. It's the historical equivalent of being given a uniform you didn't sign up for, one that everyone instantly recognizes and judges you by. So you've wrestled with the sheer geographical variation, the fact that your legally mandated badge of identity could shift from a yellow veil in Venice to a red stripe in Florence or some other concoction elsewhere. It highlights the messy, localized reality of medieval control mechanisms. But for all that variety, there's a persistent thread, isn't there? A color that keeps popping up, linked disproportionately to this particular form of public marking. That color, of course, is yellow. Why yellow? Why did so many cities across different regions and centuries gravitate towards this specific hue when deciding how to identify and often stigmatize women engaged in sex work? To understand this, you have to step into the medieval mindset about color. Colors weren't just pigments or aesthetic choices back then. They were laden with symbolism, often deeply rooted in religious belief, tradition, and even folklore. Red could mean passion, but also blood and sacrifice. Blue could represent the Virgin Mary or loyalty. Green was associated with nature and growth, but sometimes with magic or inconstancy. And yellow? Well, yellow was a complex color in the medieval palette of meanings. It wasn't monolithic in its symbolism, but it certainly had some prominent negative associations that made it a convenient choice for marking out groups deemed undesirable or outside the norm. One of the most powerful negative associations with yellow stemmed from Christianity. Judas Iscariot, the apostle who betrayed Jesus, was frequently depicted in medieval art wearing yellow robes. Sometimes it was a dull, sickly yellow or even a greenish yellow, intended to distinguish him from the other apostles, who would be in more virtuous or traditional colors. Because of this visual tradition, yellow became linked to betrayal, deceit, treachery, and hypocrisy. Imagine being forced to wear a color so strongly associated with the ultimate act of betrayal against the central figure of the dominant religion. It's a symbolic burden designed to weigh heavy, immediately signaling untrustworthiness or moral failing to anyone who saw you. It's like being forced to wear a t-shirt today that just says, "I'm really bad at keeping promises." Beyond betrayal, yellow also carried associations with sickness, particularly jaundice, which causes the skin to turn yellow. It was linked to illness, decay, and sometimes even death or quarantine. While medieval understanding of disease transmission was vastly different from ours, there were certainly anxieties around illness, especially during outbreaks of plague or other epidemics. Forcing a marginalized group to wear the color of sickness could serve to visually quarantine them, reinforcing the idea that they were somehow unhealthy or contaminating influences on the pure body of society. It was a way of saying not just that you were morally suspect, but perhaps physically tainted as well. Another possible layer of symbolism connects yellow to jealousy, avarice, and sometimes even cowardice, though the Judas association is arguably the most dominant negative one. But any combination of these negative meanings would make yellow a potent visual marker for a group that medieval authorities often viewed through a lens of moral judgment, economic transaction, and social distance. It wasn't just a neutral identifier. It was an identifier loaded with intended meaning, designed to elicit a specific reaction from the viewer, usually caution, disapproval, or avoidance. Now, it's important to note that yellow also had positive connotations. Bright golden yellow could symbolize sunlight, warmth, divinity, think halos, and wealth gold. The robes of kings or high-ranking clergy might incorporate rich yellows. Saffron, a spice that produced a vibrant golden yellow dye, was incredibly expensive and used for luxurious fabrics. So yellow wasn't universally bad, but the shade mattered, and the context mattered. The dull, sickly yellow associated with Judas or jaundice was distinct from the shimmering gold of a saint's halo. And when applied as a mandatory public marker for a marginalized group, the negative symbolism was almost certainly the intended message. It's like how the color black can be sleek and fashionable, but also signifies mourning. It depends on the context and the intent behind its use. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the deliberate negative symbolism of yellow is its use for marking other marginalized groups. Most notably in many medieval cities, particularly from the 13th century onwards, Jewish people were frequently required by law to wear a distinguishing marker, often a yellow badge or piece of cloth. This requirement, stemming from decrees like the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which initially mandated distinguishing dress for Jews and Muslims but didn't specify color, later local laws often chose yellow, was explicitly designed to make them visible and separate from the Christian population. This shared use of yellow for both Jews and women engaged in sex work suggests a common thread. Yellow was a color chosen to visually segregate and identify groups perceived as outsiders, morally suspect, or distinct from the Christian majority. It links the marking of sex workers not just to sumptuary laws about status, but also to laws about religious or social difference. You weren't just being identified by your profession. You were being lumped in, visually at least, with other groups deemed undesirable or requiring segregation by the dominant powers. Pragmatism might have played a role too, though perhaps a secondary one compared to symbolism. Was yellow dye cheap and easily available? Some yellow dyes, like those derived from weld or turmeric, were relatively common and inexpensive compared to costly dyes like true purple from murex snails, or certain vibrant reds. Using a widely available color might have made the implementation of the law easier. The required marker could be produced and distributed or acquired by the women themselves, without undue expense, ensuring compliance was possible. Also, bright yellow is a very visible color. In the often drab clothing of the Middle Ages, a splash of bright yellow would stand out immediately, fulfilling the primary purpose of the marker: easy identification from a distance. So it could have been a combination of symbolic weight and practical considerations. It's like choosing high-visibility yellow for modern safety vests. It works well for being seen, but back then, that visibility was about being seen in a way that invited judgment, not safety. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for choosing yellow was its association with Judas and betrayal, its link to sickness and contagion, its shared use with other marginalized groups, like Jews, suggesting a general outsider symbolism, or simply its practicality as a cheap and visible dye. It's likely a complex interplay of these factors, varying in emphasis depending on the specific city and the intent behind the decree. Was the city council more concerned with moral policing, economic regulation, or public health, as understood then? Their priorities would likely color their choice of color and the reasons they gave for it. Some decrees might explicitly mention avoiding deception, linking to betrayal, while others might focus on distinguishing respectable women, linking to the need for segregation. Let's consider a quirky or fringe tidbit related to the dye itself. The intensity and fastness of medieval yellow dyes varied significantly depending on the source material and the mordant used, the substance that helps the dye bond to the fabric. Some yellows were bright and durable, while others faded quickly to a dull beige or brown. This could lead to disputes about compliance. Imagine a woman being fined because her legally mandated yellow veil had faded in the wash or from sun exposure. Officials might argue the color was no longer sufficiently yellow to serve as a proper marker. Records sometimes mention requirements for the quality of the dye or fabric for these markers, suggesting that authorities weren't just asking for some yellow thing, but a specific, identifiable, and hopefully somewhat permanent yellow. It adds a layer of bureaucratic absurdity to the oppression. Not only must you wear this stigmatizing color, but make sure it's the right shade of stigmatizing color and that you keep it maintained. Washed your yellow cap? Better hope it didn't fade too much, or that's another fine. It's the kind of nitpicking that makes you wonder if the officials were just having a bad day. The choice of yellow wasn't random. It was a deliberate decision rooted in the symbolic language of the time. It served not just as a label, but as a nonverbal communication of perceived status and character, instantly placing the wearer within a specific, marginalized category defined by the authorities. It reinforced the idea that these women were separate, different, and perhaps morally tainted, echoing the same visual language used for other groups the society wished to isolate or identify as other. So next time you see something yellow, maybe a taxi or a rubber duck, take a moment to think about how complex and loaded that color could be in a different era. How a simple splash of dye, universally understood in its negative context, could become a mandatory uniform of marginalization, designed to make sure you were always seen, always identified, and always perceived through a veil of symbolic judgment. It's a stark reminder that even the seemingly simple act of choosing a color can be a powerful tool of social control, weaving meaning and stigma directly into the fabric of daily life. Okay, so we've spent a considerable amount of time marinating in the various shades of yellow, contemplating why that particular color became so prevalent for designating you, or someone like you, in so many different medieval cities. We've delved into the symbolism, the practicalities, the heavy weight of Judas and jaundice hanging over the hue. But here's the thing, while yellow was common, it wasn't the only option medieval lawmakers threw onto your wardrobe. Travel just a bit, cross a border, or even just enter the next major city, and you might find the rules completely different. The mandatory marker shifts. That conspicuous yellow veil or cap you were wearing, suddenly it's meaningless here, and you need something else entirely. Think of Florence, for example, that bustling artistic heartland. While Venice might have been partial to yellow veils, Florence sometimes opted for red. Yes, red. Instead of the color of betrayal and sickness, you might find yourself legally required to display a red band, a red sash, or perhaps a patch of red cloth. Why red? Like yellow, red is a color packed with symbolism, but a different kind of packing. Red speaks of passion, love, and desire, which, feels perhaps a little on the nose, even for medieval law. But it also signifies sin, specifically carnal sin. It's the color of blood, which can represent life or death, martyrdom, or violence. It's a vibrant, attention-grabbing color, perhaps even more so than yellow in some contexts. Imagine walking through the Piazza della Signoria, your legally mandated flash of red catching the eye. You are marked just as effectively as with yellow, but the visual language, the immediate symbolic ping, feels subtly different. It's less about passive shame or sickness, and perhaps more about active sin, or even paradoxically, the scandalous allure that simultaneously titillated and repulsed the authorities. It's like deciding whether you want your warning labeled on wrong to say caution, fragile and slightly contagious, or warning may incite scandal and general disapproval. Pick your poison. And it wasn't just colors. Other cities got creative with the type of marker. Some mandated specific items of clothing you had to wear. Maybe a certain type of hat you wouldn't see on anyone else. A peculiar cap, a hood of a certain shape. Or maybe a required piece of jewelry like a ring on a specific finger. Imagine having to wear a ring not as a symbol of commitment or status, but as a badge of your profession, instantly identifiable to anyone who looked. Other places might demand stripes, a specific number or color of stripes sewn onto your sleeve or hem. Still others might require a specific piece of clothing to be made of a particular fabric or cut in an unusual way, something that visually broadcasts your identity from a distance. It's like a medieval version of those uniforms you have to wear for certain jobs today, except this uniform is designed purely for public identification and, let's be honest, often for public shaming. So why this patchwork quilt of dress codes across Europe? Why couldn't they just pick one thing, like a universal badge, maybe a little embroidered cat? Though that would probably have its own weird medieval symbolism we're not even aware of. The main reason is the incredibly fragmented political landscape of the time. The Middle Ages weren't like modern countries with centralized governments dictating uniform laws from a capital city. Power was distributed among kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and crucially, independent city-states. These cities, particularly in places like Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries, often had significant autonomy to govern themselves, levy taxes, and enact their own local ordinances. Sumptuary laws, the category under which these dress codes often fell, were inherently local. A city council, perhaps influenced by local clergy, guild interests, or prevailing social anxieties, would pass a law tailored to their specific situation. They weren't looking at what Venice or Florence was doing necessarily, though ideas certainly traveled. They were addressing their perceived local problems with public order, morality, and the visual hierarchy of their own streets. One city might be particularly worried about respectable women being mistaken for sex workers, thus focusing on a marker that was highly visible and distinct. Another might be more concerned with controlling the trade for taxation purposes, needing a marker that allowed easy identification by officials collecting fees. Yet another might be driven primarily by moral outrage, selecting a symbol with the most damning religious connotations. This highlights a mainstream historical fact. The regulation of daily life, including things like clothing and social behavior, in the Middle Ages was overwhelmingly a local affair, reflecting the diverse legal and social customs of individual towns and regions, rather than top-down national mandates. There was no European Union of dress codes deciding everyone had to wear chartreuse stockings or something equally dreadful. Each city was its own little laboratory of social control, experimenting with different methods to achieve similar ends, identifying, segregating, and often stigmatizing certain groups. Historians still debate whether the variety in these markers reflects genuinely different local attitudes towards sex work. Did a city mandating a discreet armband view the profession differently from one requiring a bright, full veil? Or was it just a matter of administrative preference? What was easiest to enforce? Or what symbolic color happened to be locally available or historically significant for other reasons? It's hard to say. The laws themselves often use similar language about preventing deception or maintaining public order, regardless of the specific marker chosen. But the visual impact and potential symbolic weight of wearing red versus yellow, or a simple stripe versus a peculiar hat, must have felt different to the person wearing it and the people observing it. Perhaps the choice was also influenced by existing local traditions or even practicalities of dye availability or cost, although the symbolic weight seems primary in many cases. If a city's civic color was red, maybe using red for marking felt like a perverse inversion of civic pride, a way of saying, these people are the stain on our city's colors. Or perhaps yellow dye was cheaper and more accessible in one region, while red was more readily available or vibrant in another. It's a bit like trying to figure out why some cities have blue street signs and others have green. Sometimes it's a deep historical reason, and sometimes it's just, see, that's the color we picked. Let's throw in a quirky or fringe tidbit. In some areas, the required marker wasn't just about identifying you. It was about making you look ridiculous or unfashionable according to the standards of the time, regardless of color. For example, being forced to wear clothing made of rough, cheap fabric or cut in an outdated style alongside the color requirement. Imagine everyone else is wearing the latest medieval trends, pointy shoes and flowing sleeves, and you're stuck in last century's frumpy fashion, plus the mandatory yellow hat. It's an extra layer of social discomfort, designed to ensure you stood out not just by profession, but by appearing visually less than the fashionable crowd. It was another way to mark you as outside the mainstream, using the subtle or not so subtle language of clothing status. It wasn't enough to just identify. You had to be made aesthetically undesirable too. Talk about hitting a person when they're down. This variation also created potential problems, not just for the women, but for the authorities too. How did they ensure compliance when the rules changed from town to town? Someone traveling might genuinely not know the local dress code. Would ignorance be a valid defense? Probably not. It also meant that the visual signal was only effective locally. Your yellow veil worked wonders in Venice, instantly communicating your identity and presumed status to Venetians. But if you took that same veil to Florence, it might mean nothing, or worse, be misinterpreted. You'd need to swap it out for a red band or whatever the local rule was. This fluidity underscores how these laws were less about a universal moral code applied across Europe and more about maintaining specific, localized social orders and visual boundaries. The fact that these rules existed at all in such varied forms tells you a lot about the medieval fascination with external appearance as a reflection of internal state or social role. They truly believed that by regulating what you wore, they could reinforce social hierarchies, control behavior, and maintain a visually legible society. Your clothing wasn't just protection from the elements. It was your public declaration of who you were, what you did, and where you stood in the complex social web. And for women engaged in sex work, that public declaration was a mandatory, conspicuous, and often heavily symbolic marker. Whether it was the betrayal-tinged yellow, the sin-soaked red, or some other unique local invention. It was a uniform designed to isolate you, no matter what color it was. So you've got your legally mandated marker, whether it's the classic yellow veil we started with, a splash of Florentine red, or some other locally peculiar signifier, like a striped sleeve or an unfortunate hat. You're wearing it, or you're trying to decide if you're going to wear it today. Because just like any law ever invented by humans, these rules weren't just handed down on stone tablets from a mountain. They had to be enforced. And enforcing dress codes in bustling medieval cities? Let me tell you, it was probably about as fun and effective as trying to get a cat into a bath using only politely worded requests. Medieval cities didn't have police forces as we understand them today. With squad cars and badges and, crucially, radios, law enforcement was much more decentralized and often, well, a bit chaotic. Responsibility for keeping order, including enforcing these sumptuary laws, fell to a mix of officials. You might have city watchmen, often part-time guys who also had other jobs, lumbering through the streets, peering suspiciously at people's outfits. There could be specific market officials or guild representatives who had the authority to check that people operating in their area were following the rules. In some places, the job might even fall to lower-level civic officers, maybe folks responsible for public hygiene or checking weights and measures, who just had this extra duty tacked on. They weren't exactly ninjas of enforcement. Detection was often a pretty straightforward affair, seeing if you were wearing the thing. Imagine the scene. You're walking through the marketplace, maybe trying to buy some apples, or just get from one place to another without drawing too much attention. Suddenly, there's a couple of burly-looking guys in slightly fancier tunics than average. Official-looking, perhaps, just standing there, scanning the crowd. Their eyes drift over you, checking for that telltale flash of color or unusual garment. It's not subtle. It's like walking through a security checkpoint where they're only looking for bright yellow items. Inspections might happen in specific locations known for commercial sex work, like designated brothel areas or certain taverns. But they could also be more random, popping up in busy squares or near city gates. It's a constant, low-level anxiety. Every official-looking person, every group of watchmen approaching, sends a little jolt of fear through you. Are they just passing by? Are they looking at me? Did my veil slip? Is the light making this red band look less vibrant than it should? It's the medieval equivalent of constantly checking if your fly is down, but with much higher stakes. Being caught without the required marker or wearing something deemed insufficient or incorrect wasn't usually met with immediate execution, thankfully. Sumptuary law violations generally fell into the category of minor offenses, at least initially. The most common punishment was a fine, money, handing over coin to the city coffers. The amount could vary, but it was often significant enough to be a real burden, especially if you weren't exactly rolling in ducats or florins. For officials, these fines could even be a small source of revenue, which, cynically speaking, might have been part of the motivation for enforcement in the first place. Oh, look, a woman without her yellow hood. Cha-ching! Whoa, it's less about moral purity and more about filling the treasury, isn't it? Like getting a parking ticket today. It stings, and you know the city loves getting that easy money. But fines weren't the only penalty. For repeat offenders, or perhaps if an official was having a bad day, things could escalate. Public shaming was a popular medieval pastime, and sumptuary law violations were fair game. You might be put into the stocks, a truly humiliating experience where you are locked into a wooden frame in a public square, exposed to the jeers and sometimes even rotten fruit thrown by passersby. Pro tip, duck. Or you might be paraded through the streets, maybe even forced to wear the incorrect marker prominently, or a sign explaining your offense. Banishment from the city was another possibility, a severe punishment that cut you off from your network, your livelihood, your home. Imagine being told to leave town because your hat was the wrong color. It's absurd, but it happened. These risks weren't just theoretical. You knew someone or knew of someone who had been fined or put in the stocks or told to pack their bags. The stories circulated, warnings passed quietly among women in your profession. It reinforced the pressure to comply, even if the rule felt arbitrary or unfair. The constant threat of discovery and punishment hung over you, a low cloud in the already complicated sky of medieval urban life. Given the hassle and the potential punishments, you might wonder why anyone would ever try to skirt the rules. Well, humans are humans, and rules, especially inconvenient ones, are made to be bent, if not broken. Overt defiance, refusing to wear the marker entirely and daring them to catch you, was probably rare. That was just asking for trouble. But quiet, subtle resistance? That was likely happening all the time. Maybe you wore the yellow veil, but you chose the thinnest, most translucent fabric you could find. Or you secured it in a way that made it less voluminous, less immediately obvious. If the rule was a patch on the sleeve, perhaps you stitched it on with thread that was just a little too close to the sleeve color, or placed it in a spot that was often covered by your cloak or a basket you were carrying. It was about minimizing the visibility, making the required marker technically present, but failing the spirit of the law. It's the medieval version of turning down the volume on your car stereo when you see a police car. You're still breaking the rule, but you're trying to be discreet about it. Another strategy might be selective compliance. You wear the marker when you're working in areas known for strict enforcement or when you expect to encounter officials. But when you're just going about your personal business, maybe visiting a friend across town or going to a less regulated district, off comes the veil or the patch. It's a calculated risk, balancing the annoyance and potential stigma of wearing the marker constantly against the risk of getting caught without it. This required local knowledge, knowing which streets were patrolled, which officials were sticklers for the rules, and which parts of town were practically lawless when it came to dress codes. Simply hoping not to get caught was, of course, always an option, especially if the enforcement was patchy or inconsistent, which it often was. Medieval authorities had a lot on their plate: theft, assault, public drunkenness, stray pigs. So chasing down every woman without the correct headwear wasn't always their top priority. You might gamble that on any given day, the watchman would be busy dealing with a tavern brawl or searching for a runaway apprentice, and you could slip by unnoticed. It was a gamble, though, a game of chance played out on the cobblestone streets. And then there was the age-old method of greasing the wheels. Bribing officials was, sadly, a fairly common feature of medieval life. A small coin slipped into a watchman's hand, or a promise of future favors, might convince him that actually he doesn't see a missing yellow veil after all. This wasn't something every woman could afford or would dare to attempt, but for some, it might have been a viable way to navigate the system, especially if they were doing well enough to have some spare and it highlights how enforcement wasn't just about the letter of the law, but about the messy human reality of who was enforcing it and who they were enforcing it upon. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact about medieval law enforcement. It was heavily reliant on community involvement and informal social control alongside the actions of designated officials. In theory, any citizen might be expected to report someone violating a law, including sumptuary laws. This created a climate of potential surveillance, where it wasn't just officials you had to watch out for, but nosy neighbors or self-appointed moral guardians. However, the effectiveness of this varied wildly. In practice, ordinary people might just ignore minor infractions, or even help someone avoid getting caught, especially if they didn't agree with the law or had a personal connection to the person. It wasn't always a unified front of enforcement. Historians still debate the overall effectiveness of these sumptuary laws, including those targeting identifying markers for sex workers. Did they genuinely succeed in their stated goals of preventing deception, maintaining social order, and reducing public scandal? Or were they largely performative laws, passed to appease moralists and city fathers, but consistently undermined by lax enforcement, public indifference, and the ingenuity of those trying to evade them? It's difficult to measure. We have the laws themselves and records of fines or punishments, but we don't know how many violations went unnoticed or unpunished. It's likely that while the laws created significant hardship and risk for the targeted women, they didn't completely stamp out either the profession or the occasional decision not to wear the required marker. They probably made life harder and more precarious, rather than fundamentally changing the landscape. Let's add a quirky or fringe tidbit about enforcement. In some towns, the task of identifying and reporting women who weren't complying fell to specific guild members or professional groups who felt they had a vested interest in preventing deception. For example, tailors or hat makers might be empowered or required to report customers who seemed to be making garments or headwear that violated the rules. Or in places with officially sanctioned brothels, the brothel madam herself might be held responsible for ensuring the women working for her wore the correct markers, adding another layer of internal enforcement and control. It's a strange system where your livelihood is tied to policing the dress codes of the people who work for you, presumably to keep the authorities off everyone's back. It turns your boss into a fashion compliance officer, which sounds like a truly miserable job for everyone involved. The constant push and pull between law and evasion, between official decree and individual survival, was a defining feature of life under these sumptuary laws. You are always performing a calculation. Is the risk of being caught worth the relief of not wearing this uncomfortable, embarrassing, or simply inconvenient marker? Is this official paying attention? Can I just walk quickly past? The streets of a medieval city weren't just pathways. They were stages where the drama of social control and subtle resistance played out every day, mediated by the color of a veil or the presence or absence of a simple patch. And you were one of the lead actors, whether you wanted the role or not. So you're lumbered with this vibrant, heavy symbolism, this color yellow screaming, "I am other," every time you step out your door. But how much did that really impact daily life? Because just having a law on the books and actually enforcing it are two very different things then is now. Think about all those traffic laws you vaguely know exist, but definitely ignore if you're in a hurry and there isn't a cop around. Medieval law was often like that, only with more potential for public shaming and less chance of a dash cam video. The reality is, while many towns and cities across Europe did enact laws requiring prostitutes to wear distinctive clothing, often yellow, the details varied wildly. It wasn't like the EU passing a directive that applied everywhere automatically. Each city council, each duke, each prince, heck, sometimes even just the local bishop, depending on their secular power, could set their own rules. One town might require a yellow veil, another a yellow stripe on a cloak, another a specific piece of yellow fabric sewn onto the shoulder. The shade of yellow could differ too, from a glorious sun yellow to a sickly, sulfurous hue, though as we discussed, the exact color specification could be lost to time or left to the interpretation of the dye maker. And the reasoning, while generally tied into that negative symbolism we just explored, wasn't always purely moralistic. Some cities saw regulating prostitution, including identifying practitioners, as a way to manage public health, tying back to the yellow bile sickness association maybe, but also practical concerns about venereal diseases, even if their understanding was limited. Others saw it as a form of public order, keeping things tidy, knowing who was who. Crucially, many municipalities also saw it as a potential source of revenue. If you're going to regulate it, you might as well tax it, right? Legalized or semi-legalized brothels, often located in specific areas, red light districts aren't a modern invention, could be taxed, licensed, and controlled. And the requirement for distinctive dress was part of that control mechanism. So a law about yellow clothing wasn't just about shaming. Sometimes it was part of a whole regulatory package that acknowledged prostitution existed and sought to profit from it, rather than just suppress it entirely. It was a complicated moral tightrope they walked. Now enforcing these laws? That was the sticky part. Imagine you're a medieval city watchman. Your job is already tough. Look out for fires, catch thieves, break up bar brawls, maybe make sure the pigs aren't running wild in the main square. And on top of all that, you're supposed to patrol the streets and make sure every woman who might be a prostitute is wearing her designated patch of yellow. Sounds exhausting and probably pretty awkward. "Excuse me, madam, lovely wimple, but could you clarify your marital and professional status? And perhaps lift your cloak slightly so I can check for regulation color patches?" Not exactly a career path for the shy, so there were a few reasons why enforcement was, shall we say, inconsistent. Firstly, identification wasn't always easy. How do you definitively prove someone is a prostitute just by looking at them, particularly if they are trying not to look like one? The laws were designed to make them visible, yes, but people are adaptable. Maybe they'd try to cover the yellow patch, or only wear it in certain areas, or maybe the law had loopholes. What if a respectable woman genuinely liked the color yellow? Highly unlikely given the stigma, but you get the point. How did officials differentiate? Then there was the sheer practicality in bustling medieval towns. Streets were crowded, people were moving constantly. Unless a woman was actively soliciting in a known area or registered with a municipal brothel, spotting and verifying compliance would have been incredibly difficult. It wasn't like they had databases or photographs. It often came down to local knowledge or perhaps complaints from neighbors or rivals. And let's be honest, there was probably a fair bit of looking the other way. Officials could be bribed, or they might have their own reasons for not enforcing the law too strictly. Maybe they were clients themselves, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Or they might just have bigger problems to deal with, like that cart of manure that just overturned on High Street. Prioritization, right? Resistance from the women themselves was also a factor. Why would you willingly wear something that marked you for public scorn and possibly danger? They likely tried to evade the rules whenever possible. This could mean wearing the marker under an outer layer or in a less conspicuous spot than legally required, or only in specific zones, or perhaps just taking the risk and hoping not to get caught. Evading sumptuary laws in general was common. People have always loved pushing the boundaries of what they're allowed to wear. This was just a much higher stakes version of that. The punishment for noncompliance varied, but none of it was pleasant. Fines were common, hitting them in the purse, which was already likely precarious. Public humiliation was another favorite medieval tactic. Being paraded through the streets, sometimes mocked or pelted with refuse, was a way to reinforce the stigma and make an example. In some cases, repeated offenses could lead to imprisonment or even banishment from the city limits, a potentially devastating punishment that stripped away their livelihood and social ties. But again, the severity and frequency of these punishments depended heavily on the specific location and the political climate. Think of it like trying to enforce a dress code at a notoriously rowdy party. You can announce the rules, absolutely no Hawaiian shirts, but actually making sure everyone complies when the music is loud and people are having fun. Good luck. Medieval cities, while perhaps less party, were often chaotic and decentralized enough that maintaining strict control over personal appearance, especially for marginalized groups, was a constant challenge. Historians still argue whether these sumptuary laws, including those targeting prostitutes with yellow markers, were primarily intended for social control and moral signaling, or whether the economic aspect, taxation and regulation, was the stronger motivator. Was it about protecting the morals of the good citizens, or about squeezing revenue out of an inevitable profession? The answer is probably a mix of both, varying depending on the specific city and time period. Some cities had a more puritanical approach, attempting to suppress prostitution altogether, while others adopted a more pragmatic, regulatory stance, recognizing it couldn't be eliminated and aiming to manage it. The yellow marker fit into both models, serving as a public notice whether the goal was shaming or simply identification for administrative purposes. The existence of designated stews or brothel areas in many cities also complicated things. If women were confined to specific licensed zones, did they still need the yellow marker? Outside those zones? Or was the location itself the marker? Laws varied. In some areas, like parts of France or Italy, municipal brothels were quite regulated, almost like public utilities of vice, and the women working there might have had different rules than independent streetwalkers. It's easy to imagine the cat and mouse game, the watchman trying to spot the telltale yellow, the woman trying to keep it hidden, the official demanding a fine, the woman trying to talk her way out of it or offer a bribe, the public witnessing it all, maybe gossiping, maybe indifferent, maybe even occasionally protective of someone they knew. It wasn't just abstract law, it was played out on the ground, in the mud and dust of the medieval streets. And this variability and patchy enforcement highlight a key aspect of medieval life that's easy to forget when you're looking at neat legal texts. Authority was fragmented, communication was slow, local custom held immense power. So while the idea of marking out certain groups with specific colors, like yellow for prostitutes, was widespread and deeply rooted in shared symbolism, the reality of its implementation was a patchwork of different rules, different levels of enforcement, and constant negotiation between the lawmakers, the enforcers, and the people being regulated. It wasn't a perfectly applied uniform system. It was messy, human, and often, I suspect, ignored as much as it was followed. Kind of like trying to get everyone in your neighborhood to put their recycling bin out on the correct day. There's a law, sure, but, well, This makes it challenging for historians to get a completely clear picture. We have the legal texts, the decrees from city councils and rulers. We have some court records documenting punishments for noncompliance. We have artistic depictions that sometimes show these markers, though art isn't always a reliable historical source for everyday life. But piecing together how consistently these laws were applied, how effective they were in shaping public perception, or controlling behavior, and how women navigated these rules on a daily basis. That requires careful sifting through often incomplete or biased sources. It's clear the intention was to make this group visible and set apart using a color loaded with negative meaning. It's less clear how successful they were in making that a daily, unavoidable reality for every single person the law was intended to cover. The laws existed, they carried weight and danger if enforced, but the street-level experience was likely much more fluid and unpredictable than the legal text might suggest. It was a constant push and pull between the desire for control and the messy, unmanageable reality of urban life and human behavior. So you've got this law inconsistently applied, a sort of looming threat or occasional indignity, depending on where you are and who's on duty. But even if it wasn't enforced perfectly every single day, the existence of a law requiring you to wear a symbol of your perceived degradation had a very real impact. It wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was a constant public declaration, forced upon you, about who you were in the eyes of the state, and more importantly, the wider community. Imagine walking down the street. Every eye that lands on you, if they know the rules of the city, immediately tags you. They see the yellow, and they know. You're not just a woman buying bread or walking to the market or trying to get through your day. You are that woman marked by law. It's an intense form of public shaming designed to isolate you, to make respectable folk recoil. It's like having a giant neon sign above your head saying, "Avoid eye contact, potential source of sin and disease." Not exactly a great way to boost your self-esteem or make friends, is it? The psychological toll must have been immense. To be constantly reminded of your marginalized status, to face potential scorn, whispers, or outright harassment from strangers just because you're wearing a mandated color, that chips away at you. It internalizes the stigma. You might start to see yourself through the eyes of the judgmental society around you. It reinforces the idea that you are other, unclean, or fallen, concepts that were deeply ingrained in medieval Christian society. And this wasn't just a private struggle. It was a performance of shame enacted in the public square every single day you stepped outside. It's the ultimate awkward elevator ride, except the elevator is the entire city and everyone inside silently, or not so silently, judges your outfit choice. Beyond the psychological burden, the social consequences were severe. The yellow marker was designed to set you apart, quite literally. It made it harder, perhaps impossible, to blend in, to participate in normal social interactions without that label preceding you. Respectable society would be wary of associating with you. Merchants might be reluctant to serve you or charge you exorbitant prices. Other women, especially those concerned with their own reputation, would steer clear. It created a social moat around you, enforcing segregation and reinforcing your isolation within a specific, often reviled group. This isolation wasn't just about hurt feelings. It had practical implications. If you were trying to leave the profession, the yellow mark would follow you. How could you hope to find work in a different trade or integrate into a different social circle if you were immediately identifiable as someone who had been marked out? It created a trap. The very law intended to control and stigmatize prostitution also made it incredibly difficult to escape from. It was like trying to ditch a particularly clingy ex, but the X is a bright yellow badge sewn onto your clothes that everyone points at. The economic impact ties directly into this. While some cities regulated prostitution as a source of tax revenue, the individual women themselves often operated on the fringes of legality and respectability. The yellow mark could make it harder to attract clients. Depending on the client, I suppose some might prefer the clear identification, but it definitely made it harder to earn money in any other way. You couldn't easily take on laundry work or sell goods in the market or become a servant if your identity was publicly broadcast as a prostitute. This dependency on their primary source of income, however precarious, was reinforced by the very laws designed to regulate them. It limited options and reduced bargaining power. It was a system designed to keep you down, both socially and economically. Like a really ineffective career advisor whose only suggestion is, maybe try wearing more yellow. This enforced visibility also made women more vulnerable. vulnerable to harassment from officials, certainly, but also from the general public. Drunken men, self-righteous moralists, or just plain cruel individuals might feel emboldened to accost someone they knew was legally and socially marginalized. Protection from abuse or violence would be hard to come by. Who would believe or defend a woman who was officially branded as immoral? Reporting crimes would be risky, potentially leading to scrutiny of their own activities. The yellow veil wasn't just a symbol, it was a target. Of course, human resilience is powerful. Not everyone would simply accept this fate passively. There would be strategies for coping, for resistance, for finding community within the marginalized group. Women would support each other, share information about avoiding detection or dealing with officials, and create their own social networks. Designated brothel areas, while isolating, could also provide a degree of safety in numbers and a sense of community, away from the direct gaze of mainstream society. It wasn't just unrelieved misery. There would be moments of connection, solidarity, and perhaps even defiance. Like forming a secret club where the entry password is, "Did you see what color veil Beatrice was wearing yesterday?" The audacity. One mainstream historical fact about this era is that sumptuary laws regulating clothing, food, and consumption based on social class or status, were very common across medieval Europe. Rulers and city councils used these laws to maintain social order, prevent people from dressing above their station, and reinforce existing hierarchies. Laws dictating what colors, fabrics, or styles people could wear were widespread, applying to everyone from peasants to nobility. The laws targeting prostitutes with yellow were just one specific, highly stigmatizing example within this broader tradition of using clothing as a tool of social control. It wasn't the only group whose clothing was regulated, but they were certainly singled out for particularly negative and isolating treatment. A quirky or fringe tidbit: while yellow was common, other colors and markers were sometimes used depending on the region and time period. In some places, it might be a specific cap, a patch of a different color, like striped or red, or even specific footwear. The variety in the exact requirement highlights how localized and fragmented medieval law could be. It wasn't always a standard yellow veil. Sometimes it was a yellow ribbon, or a yellow sleeve, or a yellow apron. Imagine trying to keep track of the dress code differences between neighboring towns. Right, in Ghent, it's a yellow veil on Thursdays, but in Bruges, it's a red sash every day except Sundays. Unless it's a feast day, then it's plaid. Oh, forget it, I'll just wear gray. The long-term effects of these laws on the perception and treatment of sex workers are still felt today. The idea of marking out certain groups for public identification and discrimination, while not always done through clothing anymore, persists in various forms. The legacy of shame and isolation created by medieval laws like the yellow veil requirements contributed to the enduring stigma surrounding sex work, making it harder for individuals in the profession to access rights, safety, and social acceptance, even in modern times. It built a historical foundation for discrimination that wasn't easily dismantled. Historians still argue whether the primary goal of these specific laws and medieval sumptuary laws in general was genuinely about maintaining public morality and order, or if it was more about reinforcing existing power structures and controlling marginalized populations for economic or political gain. Was the Yellow Veil Law a sincere, albeit misguided, attempt to manage perceived social problems? Or was it primarily a way to demonize and control a vulnerable group while potentially also creating a taxable industry? The motivations were likely complex and varied by location, but the effect was undoubtedly one of significant social and personal hardship for the women targeted. The societal impact wasn't limited to the women wearing the marks. These laws also shaped the behavior and attitudes of the respectable population. By legally mandating the identification of prostitutes and associating them with a color of negativity and exclusion, the laws reinforced and perhaps even amplified existing prejudices. They told ordinary citizens how they were expected to view and treat these women as separate, potentially dangerous, and certainly worthy of scorn. It legalized and normalized discrimination. Children growing up seeing women marked with yellow would learn that these individuals were different, inferior, and to be avoided. It was social conditioning writ in bright fabric. Consider the potential for misuse or false accusation. What if a woman who wasn't a prostitute wore something accidentally resembling the required marker? Or what if someone wanted to harm an enemy by planting the marker on their clothing or falsely reporting them? The potential for abuse of such a visible, stigmatizing system was high. Proving you weren't what the authorities claimed you were, especially if you were already poor or lacked powerful connections, would have been incredibly difficult. The laws also highlight the hypocrisy often present in medieval society regarding sex. While prostitution was officially condemned and its practitioners shamed, it was also tolerated, regulated, and utilized for tax revenue or to protect the virtue of respectable women by providing an outlet for male desire, or even as a way to manage the sexual activity of soldiers or travelers. Men who used the services of prostitutes were generally not subject to the same level of public shaming or legal marking. The burden of the sin and the public display of shame fell squarely on the women. This double standard was a feature, not a bug, of the system. It ensured that the social order, and particularly the status of respectable married women, was protected, while the necessary but despised function of prostitution was pushed to the visible, marked margins. It's like saying, okay, you can have pizza, but the delivery guy has to wear a clown suit, making the delivery guy the focus of the weirdness, not the fact that you ordered pizza in the first place. This societal enforcement of stigma wasn't just passive avoidance. It could manifest as active hostility. Stories from various periods and regions describe public harassment, verbal abuse, and even physical attacks on women perceived to be prostitutes, sometimes with the implicit or explicit approval of onlookers or even authorities, because the women were seen as having forfeited their right to protection by engaging in their profession. The yellow marker made them easy targets. Thinking back to those different motivations, public health, public order, taxation, moral control, the yellow marker served multiple purposes simultaneously. It identified women for potential health checks, though medieval understanding of disease was limited. It helped authorities manage and locate the population for regulation and taxation, and it performed the crucial function of public shaming and segregation necessary for moral control. It was a multi-tool of medieval urban management, all rolled into one brightly colored symbol. The legacy of these laws, while perhaps not directly remembered in popular consciousness, continues to influence how sex work is perceived and regulated in many parts of the world. The idea of criminalization, marginalization, and the association with immorality has deep historical roots, and the medieval yellow veil laws are a stark early example of official, state-sanctioned discrimination and stigma through forced public identification. It's a reminder that the clothes we wear, or are forced to wear, can carry incredible social weight and have profound effects on our lives and how we are treated. A uniform can denote belonging and status, but a forced marker can denote exclusion and shame. And in the case of that medieval yellow, it was very much the latter, a heavy burden, quite literally, to bear. So we've journeyed through this very specific, seemingly strange corner of medieval history, tracing the threads of laws that dictated the color of veils worn by women engaged in prostitution. You felt the weight of that yellow cloth, imagined the public gaze, and understood the layers of control, shame, and vulnerability it represented. But why dwell on such a niche antique regulation? Because history isn't just a collection of facts locked away in dusty books. It's a living thing that shapes our present. The attitudes, prejudices, and regulatory impulses that led to yellow veils didn't vanish with the Middle Ages. They evolved, mutated, and continue to influence how societies perceive and legislate sex work today. The echo of that medieval yellow still resonates in the ways we talk about, treat, and try to control the world's oldest profession. Think about it. The core impulse behind the yellow veil laws was to identify, segregate, and stigmatize a specific group of people engaged in a specific type of labor, deeming it inherently immoral or dangerous to the social fabric. This same impulse drives many modern laws and societal attitudes towards sex work. Whether it's through outright criminalization, making it illegal for individuals to sell sex, through criminalizing clients, aiming to reduce demand, or through zoning laws that push adult businesses into specific, often marginalized areas. The desire to identify, isolate, and control remains a powerful force. It's a direct lineage from the medieval need to make the undesirable visible and contained. We might not use yellow cloth anymore, but the effect of making sex workers other and pushing them to the fringes persists. The stigma, too, is a direct descendant. Remember how the yellow veil marked a woman for public scorn and isolation? Modern sex workers often face similar, if less legally codified, social stigma. They might struggle to access housing, banking services, or other forms of employment simply because of what they do or have done. The judgment isn't sewn onto a piece of fabric, but it can be just as visible and damaging in the eyes of many people. It's that same ingrained discomfort and moral disapproval, just wearing slightly more contemporary clothes. It's like that awkward moment when you realize your historical research project topic is still causing drama millennia later. You thought you were just looking at old clothes, but nope, it's still relevant drama. The debate over how to regulate sex work is incredibly complex, and historical perspectives, like the ones we've explored, are often silently embedded in the arguments. Those who advocate for stricter controls, perhaps pushing for criminalization, might consciously or unconsciously draw on historical ideas about public morality and the need to suppress or contain perceived social ills. They might see sex work as inherently harmful or exploitative, echoing the medieval church's condemnation and the state's efforts to manage the problem. It's the out of sight, out of mind, maybe also in jail run approach, which has deep historical roots. On the other hand, proponents of decriminalization or legalization often argue from a position that acknowledges the failures of historical approaches, including the kind of laws we've discussed. They might point out that criminalization and stigmatization don't eliminate sex work. They simply push it underground, making it more dangerous and harder to regulate for safety, health, and labor rights. They might argue that treating sex work as a moral failing to be punished rather than a form of labor with its own complexities and potential risks like any other job replicates the harms of past stigmas, like the yellow veil. It's the maybe treating people like criminals makes things worse. Who knew perspective, informed by the messy reality of history. A mainstream historical fact that connects to this is that the regulation of sex work has fluctuated dramatically throughout history and across cultures. While medieval Europe used methods like segregation and identification markers, other societies, like ancient Greece or Rome, had different, sometimes more integrated approaches, although often still within a framework of social hierarchy and control. The idea of state involvement in regulating sex work is ancient, but the methods and the severity of the associated stigma have varied wildly, reflecting different cultural values, religious beliefs, and economic priorities. The yellow veil era is just one particularly stark example of a highly punitive and shaming approach within that long, varied history. A quirky or fringe tidbit in modern discussions is the debate around linguistic choices. Even the terms we use, prostitute, sex worker, person who sells sex, carry different connotations and are part of the ongoing conversation about stigma and respect. Some terms are seen as inherently shaming, while others are preferred by those advocating for decriminalization and labor rights. This sensitivity to language and the power of words to define and marginalize echoes the symbolic power embedded in that medieval yellow veil. The language we use to describe people and their work can function much like a modern-day marker, shaping perceptions and reinforcing social boundaries. It's a reminder that labels, whether verbal or visual, matter. Like calling someone a serf versus a feudal agricultural laborer, same job, wildly different vibe. Historians still argue whether the persistent stigma surrounding sex work in Western societies is primarily a legacy of medieval religious morality, an outgrowth of later Victorian social purity movements, or an intrinsic feature of patriarchal societies that seek to control female sexuality and labor. It's hard to untangle these threads. Did the medieval church's condemnation pave the way for later moral panics? Or were those later movements driven by new anxieties about industrialization and social change? The Yellow Veil laws certainly amplified the religious condemnation with state power, but pinpointing the single dominant historical source of current stigma is a complex academic puzzle. The economic angle persists too. Remember how some medieval cities taxed regulated brothels? Modern governments also grapple with the economic reality of sex work. Is it a source of potential tax revenue if legalized? Does criminalization create an untaxed, underground economy vulnerable to exploitation? These aren't new questions. They echo the pragmatic, sometimes contradictory medieval approach that simultaneously condemned and profited from the trade. The tension between moral disapproval and economic reality is a historical constant in this area. It's like wanting your cake, social purity, and eating it too, tax money from cakes, somehow. Consider the safety aspect. Medieval laws, even though seemingly punitive, sometimes had elements aimed at safety, like designated brothel areas or attempts at health checks, however rudimentary. Modern debates about decriminalization often center on improving safety outcomes for sex workers, reducing violence, preventing STIs, ensuring access to healthcare and legal protection. The argument is that bringing the work out of the shadows, where it's hidden by stigma and illegality, much like the Yellow Veil pushed it to the visible but contained margins, makes it possible to address these issues effectively. It's a different approach to safety than enforced segregation and shaming, but the concern for well-being, however framed, has historical roots. The conversation around exploitation is also deeply tied to history. Critics of sex work often highlight the potential for trafficking and coercion, viewing it as inherently exploitative. Proponents of decriminalization argue that making sex work illegal or heavily stigmatized increases the risk of exploitation because it makes workers less likely to go to the police if they are abused or trafficked, and it empowers exploitative third parties like abusive managers or traffickers who thrive in illegal or gray markets. They might look back at the medieval period and see how marginalized, legally vulnerable women were indeed often subject to exploitation, both by their employers and by officials, and argue that this is precisely what happens when you strip people of legal protection and social standing, as the Yellow Veil laws effectively did. The enduring fascination with regulating sexuality and bodies is another link. Societies across time have sought to control various aspects of human behavior, especially those related to sex, reproduction, and public order. The medieval Yellow Veil laws fit squarely within this broader historical pattern of using law and social pressure to enforce norms around sexuality and gender roles. It wasn't just about prostitution, it was about defining acceptable womanhood, acceptable work, and acceptable places within the social structure. The Yellow Veil was a tool for drawing those lines very clearly. It was the medieval version of a velvet rope, except instead of keeping you out of a VIP section, it kept you firmly in the undesirable zone. The public health angle, while rudimentary in the medieval period, is a major focus today. Modern debates about legalizing or regulating sex work often include provisions for mandatory health checks or access to healthcare, aiming to reduce the spread of STIs. While medieval health checks might have been ineffective and intrusive, the idea that sex work intersects with public health concerns is a long-standing one. The Yellow Veil might have been intended, in part, to make it easier to identify who might need such checks, however poorly executed they were. Thinking about resistance, even in the face of oppressive laws, is also relevant. While we have limited records of medieval sex workers actively protesting the Yellow Veil laws, history shows that people always find ways to adapt, resist, and build community in the face of adversity. Modern sex worker rights movements are a clear example of this, with individuals and organizations advocating for their rights, safety, and decriminalization. They are pushing back against the legacy of stigma and control, much like those medieval women who might have found small ways to mitigate the impact of the Yellow Veil, perhaps by sticking together or finding sympathetic corners of the city. It's the human spirit saying, "You can make me wear yellow, but you can't make me like it, and I'm still going to hang out with my friends." Ultimately, the story of the medieval Yellow Veil isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a powerful illustration of how laws can be used not just to regulate behavior, but to construct identity, enforce social hierarchies, and perpetuate stigma. It shows the enduring human tendency to mark out and marginalize those who don't fit neatly into prescribed social boxes. It highlights the complex interplay of morality, economics, public health, and control that has always surrounded sex work. And by understanding this history, perhaps we can engage more thoughtfully with the present-day challenges and debates, recognizing the long shadow cast by those bright yellow markers of the past. It's a reminder that the fight for dignity and safety for marginalized groups isn't new. It's been going on for centuries, sometimes one piece of cloth at a time. As you hopefully start to feel the pull of sleep, let these thoughts settle. The world is full of layers. History is tangled with the present, and sometimes the most seemingly insignificant details, like the color of a veil worn centuries ago, can reveal profound truths about society and the human condition. It's been a long journey tonight, wandering through medieval streets and sorting through old laws. The hustle and bustle of the marketplace, the stern faces of city officials, the quiet determination of women navigating difficult lives. Let those images soften now. They serve their purpose, showed us a glimpse into a different time and a different struggle. Feel yourself drifting away from the specifics, the dates, the debates. The harsh edges of the past are fading. The yellow veil is just a whisper of color now, losing its intensity, softening into twilight. The sounds of the medieval city are gone. No more shouting vendors, no more clatter of hooves on cobblestones. Just quiet, peaceful quiet. Your breathing is slow and steady, in and out. Gentle waves of calm washing over you. Let go of any lingering thoughts or worries from your own day. They can wait until morning. This time is just for you, for rest. You are safe and warm. The darkness is comforting, like a soft blanket. Just relax. Allow yourself to sink deeper into the stillness. Deeper and deeper. The story is finished. The journey is over. There is nothing left to do now but sleep. Let the peace of this quiet moment carry you, down, 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 into gentle, peaceful sleep.